Dedication and Inscription of Just Me. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Krantz. Just Me by Pearl White. To the Children of Fate. Inscription. In school we are taught that 2 times 2 equals 4. But must we accept such rules to govern our lives? For in life does not 2 times 2 sometimes really equal 5? When we judge a painting, should we scrutinize each stroke made by the artist's brush? Or should we squint our eyes and value it for the inspiration it gives us? And do we read to remember each word, or does it not suffice if out of each book we retain even a little bit of material for thought? I am trying, kind reader, to offer an excuse for writing this book. A long while ago I read The Autocrat at the Breakfast Table by Oliver Wendell Holmes, and one phrase that lingered in my mind was as follows: "Every human being can write one good book. That is the story of his or her own life." These words gave me courage, and I wrote. Alas, I find today that upon referring to said phrase, my memory has played me false, for the true wording is, that every articulately speaking human being has in him the stuff for one novel in 3 volumes 12mo has long been with me a cherished belief. So to begin with, I was wrong. I started with my pencil and pad, intending to jot down my life story, thinking that some regular author would take the material, supply a lot of flowery words and backgrounds to my rather unconventional story, and make it into a fair novel. Again I was wrong, for my publisher wanted it only in its crude form. Thus do I put forth my final argument. Perhaps in this too I am wrong. I believe one good reason why the moving pictures have become so popular is because each one of us likes to create. We see a play on the spoken stage, hear the actors speak their lines, and are simply amused or bored as the case may be, while in the picture theater we sit silently, watch the actors perform on the screen, and imagine what most of their conversation might be. Thus do we supply our own dialogue, and when we come out of the theater we have accomplished something, for we have employed our minds, and the picture play has become part of our own creation. May I ask you to do the same with my book? Paint beautiful backgrounds of long lanes, flowing rivers, singing birds, or dark cold nights, thunder and rain. Mentally supply fitting conversation, or even read between the lines your own story. P.W. End of dedication and inscription. Part 1 of Just Me by Pearl White. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. All mankind craves joy and dreads sorrow, and as we each have just one life to live, let us get the best that we can, but pay for it with the best we can give. This is a very feeble attempt at verse, but the substance of those 4 lines has been my motto through life. You who struggle through this autobiography will, I think, agree with me that I have paid a pretty high price in my youth, but still I have gotten my share of worldly goods, and the God of happiness has smiled on me too. Never before have I given out any authentic data concerning my early life, because, poor fool that I have been, I was ashamed of my humble origin and my poverty-stricken past. I would have liked my audience to believe me a petted child of the aristocracy with a brilliant line of ancestors. So many of us like to pretend that we are what we are not. But why? We are just ourselves after all, and each one of us holds our life as dear as the other. I am of the people, and it is to the people that I owe most of my good fortune. But I am glad to have known so many hard knocks in life, because I can appreciate what misery means, and if I can amuse, if only in a small way, even bring a wee little smile to the lips of those people who earn their bread by the sweat of their brow, I feel that I am doing at least a little bit for mankind. But there, it is not my intention to ramble on through the whys and wherefores of life, and I promise to tell you simply the real true story of my struggle for fame. My attempt at literature will, I know, be comic, but I hope at least to convince some of the screen or stage-struck girls that a career means a good long fight full of disappointments. To my father I owe my sense of humor, which has helped me a lot. I never knew my mother, so let us say that my guiding hand through all of these years has been more or less fate. I have struggled against it, oh, so hard, so many times, but have always been beaten. I don't think I have ever had a big ambition that has ever been realized. At first I wanted to be a bareback rider in a circus, but no, that was not to be. Then my great dream was to be a writer. I failed in that, too. I then struggled to be a great dramatic actress on the stage, but I lost out early in the game. And maybe the greatest of all, I wanted to be a wife and a mother, with a lot of kiddies on a big farm, but that didn't turn out either. So here I am, a motion picture actress, forced into it by circumstances, and only just now the ambition is beginning to dawn, and I am struggling again to reach the very top. How will fate treat me in this? Let us see. To begin with my origin. My father, Edward G. White, was born in Port Byron, New York, of just home folks people, who, however, had a good deal of money. At the age of 21, being in poor health, his mother took him to Missouri, and settled in a little town of about 300 inhabitants, called Greenridge. Just why they chose that place I know not. There he met and married a girl of 16, Elizabeth House, my mother. Of her family I know but little, as she died shortly after my birth, and when I was but 5 or 6 years old a bitter quarrel arose between the two families, which lasted until long after I drifted out into the world. I have been told that her people were Italians, their real name being Casa, which, translated into English, means house. My father's people are Americans, but a good ways back of Irish descent. My mother brought some money with her when she married, and the two little fortunes combined made them quite the richest people of this little farming town. They settled just across the road from my mother's home in an old red brick house, which was quite large, surrounded by beautiful grounds. In those days it was considered quite a wonderful estate, and I guess it was. I don't remember the house so well, but I will never forget the long driveway through rows of huge maple trees, and the long paths bordered on each side by beautiful rose bushes. It was through these same paths that my mother's ghost was supposed to have walked each night after her death. This tale was firmly believed by the whole neighborhood, and there are many people in the village who claim to have seen her. In fact, although I suppose it was only a delusion in my small mind, many is the night I have looked out of my bedroom window and thought I saw a figure in white gliding about the grounds, which I firmly believed to be the spirit of my mother. In this small town my father lived as a gentleman among the people who were mostly farmers, but he never bothered to till the soil until long after my birth, when he was forced to do so through necessity. He was an unusually handsome man of an Irish type, very well educated, extremely witty, and loved to play. His father had died 5 months before he was born, and being the only son, he was adored by his mother, who had always given him plenty of money and taught him that he was too good to work. This lesson he must have learned very well, because I don't think that he ever did really get down to labor until he was over 40 years old. But to give him credit, he does now, in his old age, work pretty hard. For about 15 years my parents lived, I suppose, the usual life. My mother was a very frail little person of less than 5 feet and very slender. Her photograph shows her to have had an unusual abundance of dark hair and a face about the same as mine, only her entire coloring was much darker. I think she must have had quite a morbid disposition, for after I was old enough to read, I found a lot of her books very much tear stained, with little diary notes written on the fly leaves, telling how she had cried all of that day or night. Also lines of how much she loved my father and how handsome he was. I also found little verses which she composed about how happy she was, and frequently on the same page would be written, "I am so unhappy, I have cried," etc., etc. She must have been a complex little creature, but she was one of God's noblewomen, for she bore 9 children in 15 years, and on the 9th, which was myself, she gave her life. My first recollection of life is of being seated in a large wooden wash tub with 2 other children and being roughly washed with laundry soap by an old colored woman. As this performance had taken place each week since my infancy, no wonder it is firmly stamped upon my memory. Even today, as I sit in a nice white tub with wonderfully perfumed soap, a mental picture arises of a very black woman sweating and scouring 3 dirty little kids. How dirty we were, and how we hated water. I think that same old tub was responsible for me not learning to swim until after I was grown up. The weekly bath is used as a joke, but to the people who lived in this little hamlet where I come from, bathing was a very serious affair. In that part of Missouri there are no natural springs. The people in the small villages, where there is no city water supply, have to depend on the rain which they catch in drain pipes built on the edge of the roofs, which carry the water down into cisterns and even barrels. I arrived at the time when our pipes, even the house, were going into decay. Consequently we had very little water, and whereas we generally got our face, hands, and feet washed every day, our weekly bath took place after the family washing had been done. All of the children were dipped into the rinsing water and given a scrubbing with homemade lye soap that well might last until the next Saturday. Oh, how I hated to be cleaned! In fact, as I remember it, I disliked most everything, and I'm quite sure I was not too popular with the people around me, myself. I was in my early days a wonderful definition of the word brat, and as ugly as a child ever was. I always had a head much too large for my body, which, by the way, was quite husky too. I had a very small snub nose and rather large greenish yellowish eyes. I was always sunburned, nearly black, and my terrible tragedy was my yellowish hair that was awfully red in the sunlight. Oh, how I used to hate the kids when they called me red-headed, cat-eyed, pearly white. I used to get so mad, but was such a coward I was afraid to even answer back. In fact, I was afraid of everything, the dark especially, which I firmly believed to be filled with monstrous goblins and boogie-boos that would devour small children when they were naughty. This had been instilled into my head by my grandmother, and as I was always doing everything that I was told not to, I was in constant fear. I was afraid even of the other children. If they hit me, I would run screaming away. I was afterwards taken in hand when I was about 6 by my father, who sent me into the dark alone, and every time I ran from the other children he would give me a good thrashing himself, so I soon found out it was easier to fight with the kids of my size than to receive my father's licking. He used to send me down to the village, which was about a mile away, in the dark night, and make me bring back a stamp or something to prove that I had been there. This was a severe training, but successful, for when I was about 12 I could lick any kid my size, and I would even defy my father himself. My father. I don't remember ever having seen him until I was nearly 4 years old, and all through childhood I could remember him as he walked through the front gate into my life one fall morning. I had tied 2 little dogs' tails together and was having a wonderful time watching them bite one another. The next thing I remember is having received an awful slap on my jaw, and I grabbed up the dogs and ran howling away. I went out and hid in the barn, and stayed there along with the two dogs the entire day. I had heard of my father from the older children, and knew that he was not a man to spare the rod. He had been away from home for a long time, but when I received that slap I suspected immediately that he must be my father returned. If he had only talked to me then, and tried to teach me right and wrong, my childhood might have been different. For that day, up in the hayloft, I stored up enough hatred to last for years, and although I was frightened of him, I always did, secretly, everything that he told me not to, then lied about it. Consequently, I became, at an early age, a brilliant liar. At the time of his entrance into my life, our family consisted of his mother, an old lady of about 85, with a mind that was pretty much unbalanced, myself, a brother named Fred, aged 6, and a sister of 7 named Grace. One older brother, George, had been given to my mother's mother, who lived across the road from us. All of the other children had died before my mother. The grandmother, the 3 of us children absolutely uncontrollable, along with the old darky we called Auntie, and a house that was going to rack and ruin, for my father by then had gone through nearly all of his money, were not what you would call a cheerful family, and I really wonder at the fact that my father had the heart to come back at all. My older sister, Grace, still remembered my mother and her teaching, but my brother and myself were absolutely devoid of a sense of right and wrong. We had never been taught religion, not even our prayers, and our poor little minds, degenerated for years, were about as cruel and dishonest as 2 children's could possibly be. We looked upon our sister as something weak and pitiful, and hated our brother, who lived across the way, wore good clothes, and had a bicycle. My mother's mother was still well-to-do. We used to go over and steal his marbles and toys and tear up his clothes. Then we drifted into stealing things from my grandmother, then from my father, and eventually we would take anything that we found around loose. Thus we became juvenile delinquents in all senses of the word. My father stayed home that trip all through the winter, and he more or less started to look after us as well as a man can. The 2 other children were sent to school, leaving me more or less alone during the day. My strong recollection of that period is of being fastened into a very tight red velvet dress, something that had been handed down from my sister, and going out to call on the villagers with my grandmother. I didn't mind this so much, as nearly every place we went they would give me cookies and candy. The one thing that I did dread was that invariably my grandmother would stand me upon a chair and say, "Now, Pearlie, say your piece for the nice people." I can still remember her favorite. It ran thus: "When I first got upon this chair, my little heart went pit-a-pat. I thought I heard somebody say, 'Whose sweet little girl is that?'" Then everybody would applaud and say, "How cute!" Eventually I refused to speak without being rewarded with candy. Then somebody must have given me some pennies, and this must have given me an idea, because I soon increased my repertoire, even adding a few songs, and every chance I had to slip away from home, I would haunt the village drugstore and post office, singing or reciting for pennies to any customers I could pick up. Sometimes I even got nickels and dimes. That was a wonderful period of candy and ice cream sodas, and I grew absolutely mad about money. Of course, I didn't know the difference between coins, but that I could buy things with them, I soon learned. My career as the village entertainer didn't last so long, for my father caught me early in the game, and I was forcibly stopped. However, it did last long enough for me to save quite a bunch of money, which I had hidden from time to time in the cellar. There were some dolls in the drugstore window which I had been coveting for a long time, so around to the drugstore I went with my savings to get myself a doll. I remember standing for hours in front of the window, and at last I grew fond of a large doll with long black curls. I guess it was only a cheap one, but to me she was a gorgeous creature. I went into the store, laid my money down on the counter, and asked for the doll. Perhaps the money was not enough, and the man who ran the drugstore had seen me hanging around so long that he felt sorry for me. Anyway, he gave me the doll, also my money back, and extracted a solemn promise from me that I would put it into the contribution box at Sunday school. That was before my entrance into church, so I fear that I never kept my promise. End of part 1. Part 2 of Just Me by Pearl White. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The drugstore man. His name, I still remember, was Fortis Redmond, and wherever he is today I feel a deep gratitude toward him, because it was he who caused the first affection my poor comic little soul had ever known. How I adored that doll, and how I adored him! This adoration lasted for years, but as I was still rather shy and timid, I was afraid to display my feelings, and I suppose he did not suspect me of having any gratitude at all. I was a funny kid, and although I did brazen up once in a while and go out and do things, still I was easily frightened and ready to run at the drop of a hat. Along about this period old Auntie disappeared. They told me that she had gone to a better world. I don't suppose that I understood anything about death, because I remember wishing that my father would go there too. I was very happy for a while, and life was all joy because there was nobody to make me go to bed early or clean me up. None of us ever paid any attention to our poor old grandmother, and I guess my father spent most of his time down at the village discussing politics and crops with the farmers. This wonderful state of affairs did not last very long. An aunt from St. Louis appeared on the scene, bringing her 4 children with her, and although it was wonderful to have so many kids to play with, it proved a catastrophe for me. My aunt and my father got together and established more or less discipline. He also started to break me of my cowardice, and made the older children keep themselves clean and wash us younger ones. We were also sent to Sunday school. Church was a place, all through childhood, of which I was very fond, even before I realized its meaning. I always liked the singing and the crowd of people. I even grew to like being dressed up in my Sunday clothes. My father must have had a religious streak just then, for I remember him as being quite a prominent figure in the Congregational church that we went to. It was also about this time that he tried to break my brother and myself from lying and stealing. But as usual, he employed drastic methods. I don't ever remember him trying to teach us that it was wrong to lie and steal, but I do remember his threats of punishment if we did. And believe me, he kept his promise when he caught us. I can remember very vividly the strap he used to employ. It was along about this time that I became acquainted with a place that afterwards figured in all my childhood dreams, ambitions, and plots. Before my birth, my father had erected a large factory for the purpose of drying apples. But this business he must have either failed or tired of, because at the time of which I speak, it had been unused for years and was starting to go to rack and ruin. The apple evaporator, as it was called, was a large, plain building, standing in one corner of the grounds about 1.5 miles from the house. There was a little pond behind it, which was frozen over in the winter and generally half dried up in the summer. It was this same little pond which caused my aunt's exit from the household. Her youngest child was about 2 years old. I guess we children must have learned at church the story of Moses and the bulrushes. Anyway, we stole a basket from somewhere, put the infant into it, and pushed it out into the middle of the pond, where by the same token it was almost drowned before it was rescued by some neighboring farm hands. So my aunt gathered together her belongings and declared that her brother's children had demoralized her own, which up to that time had been well trained. Then in dire disgust She departed. I must have gained in courage a little by that time, because I remember giving one of my cousins a good punching as they were leaving for the train. To be sure, I ran away afterwards, but never mind. My father's second marriage. It took place when I was about 6 years old. He had been in Washington, D.C., off and on, I suppose, for he married a woman from that city who had quite a good deal of money and very good social position. I remember my grandmother calling us three children together, and telling us that our father was bringing home a new mother for us, and that we must be nice and try to love her. Of course, we bitterly resented this, and began to plot about the terrible things we were going to do to her. Even my sister, who very seldom mingled with us roughneck kids, joined in this. What a gorgeous looking creature this stepmother was! She arrived in the humble little village with dozens of trunks full of wonderful clothes and absolutely dazzled the natives. To me she represented a wonderful picture in a fashion book. Poor woman! I guess her arrival in our midst was a terrible shock. I think she had expected to find a wonderful estate, well kept, with three nice little kiddies, instead of a filthy old ruin harboring a weak-minded old woman and a couple of young outlaws. In all my travels I have never met such a complex person as this stepmother was. She was ridiculously proud, and as cold and haughty as a regent queen. She must have suffered a great deal through those ensuing years, but her spirit was never broken. She at once became a stern ruler of the household, and believe me, she ruled with a rod of iron. Still, she must have had a lot of kindness smothered up somewhere in her heart, for this woman, who had never known work, dived in and resurrected the entire works. I don't know just how it came about, but that she did have a terrible temper I do know. Anyway, my father's mother was soon packed off to his sister's home, and a bitter quarrel rose between herself and my mother's mother, who lived across the road from us. And from then on we were never allowed to communicate with my mother's relations. Even my oldest brother, who lived with them, never came into our house again, nor did he even speak to us. Poor fellow! My brother Fred and myself took my stepmother's side in the quarrel, and used to shower him with rocks whenever we caught him alone on the road. Our household soon became one of cleanliness, and money became rather plentiful, because the house was completely remodeled, and we ate, bathed, and slept at regular hours. We children were each given a certain amount of work to do, such as carrying in the wood, washing the dishes, and feeding the chickens. In fact, from that time on, my stepmother, with the help of us three, did all of the work, and we never had a servant. All of the trunks of my dead mother's clothes were opened up, and she made them over for us. We had to say our prayers each night at our stepmother's knee and kiss her forehead when we said good night. She did a lot for us, I know, but her nature must have been rather devoid of tenderness. Everything was done in a cold, methodical way, and we obeyed through fear rather than from a sense of willingness. I can never remember any demonstration of affection on her part throughout my entire childhood, and I never even kissed my father until the last time I saw him, which was about 3 years ago. Then that was done more or less in a comedy spirit. For a few years we lived amid clean surroundings with plenty to eat and wear, and we certainly learned discipline, inside the house at least. We had to confine our playing and romping about during the summer months to the old apple evaporator. In the winter we were sent to school. At school I must admit I was never a great success. Besides being rather dumb, I was lazy, and the only thing I ever made much progress in was reading. I always had a vivid imagination, and how excited I used to get about fiction stories from the fairy tale days on. The schoolhouse to which we went was about 2 miles away, and as all the children walked to school, there was a chance to settle on the way home any little quarrel that might have arisen during school hours. For about half of my first term, my journey homeward was generally spent on the run, and the kids used to call me "'Fraid cat." But the tables turned along about Christmas time. On the Friday before closing school for the holidays, we had an entertainment and a Christmas tree, the first one that I had ever seen. I received several presents off the tree and a prize for reciting. A box of colored crayons it was, and I felt very superior to the other children. On the way home a boy tried to take my prize away from me, and I pitched into him with my fists and feet, and although he was larger than I had a lot of strength and gave him a good thrashing. From that time on I never ran, and I settled up a good many old grievances besides. During my second term at school I became a regular warrior and was continually getting my nose punched by the older boys, but the assurance that my father would welcome me with a trusty old strap in hand if I didn't come out victorious made me stick to the finish, and it wasn't long before all of the kids avoided picking a row with Pearl White. My first Christmas tree. The one at school, followed by one at the Methodist church. We were now Methodists. I afterwards became a Catholic. Then still another tree at home made that Christmas a time of times in my life. Dolls began to figure strongly in my life too, and I developed quite a tendency to sew clothes for them. This sewing instinct was always encouraged in me by my parents, and I am glad that it was, for in after years when I saw my hard times, it helped me a great deal to be able to make my own clothes. It was along about this time that my deportment began to get better. I think my Sunday school teacher did more for me in that line than anybody else. It was during my first vacation, I was then a little over 7, that my brother started selling newspapers, and I used to help him. In fact, I became quite a little news girl on my own hook. This was in a way responsible for my first dip into the show business. I knew some children in the village who had once been taken to a nearby city and had seen a performance of Uncle Tom's Cabin. They had told me the wonders of that show for months, and when the news arrived that Uncle Tom's Cabin was going to play Greenridge, I was in a terrible state of excitement and anticipation. It was Sunday. My father and stepmother had gone to Sedalia, the nearest town of any size. This town was 12 miles away, and they used to drive there in a one-horse cart, but the trip through the woods and over the rough roads was very tedious, so they generally spent a day or so before returning home. The troupe, which was to perform Monday afternoon and night, arrived in the village to rest over Sunday. They were to play under a canvas tent which they carried with them, as they had been showing in a lot of small towns which didn't boast a theater. I think this troupe was one of Stetson's Uncle Tom shows. Anyway, I do remember the manager's name was Hall, and he was to me then the most wonderful man that I had ever seen. Even in after years I used the name of Hall on the stage in memory of him. I guess I was the first kid on the lot when they started to put up their tent. I played hooky from Sunday school, and with my papers under my arm as an excuse, I hung around with the performers the entire morning. I finally got a little attention through singing snatches of ragtime songs that I picked up in the village. That must have given Mr. Hall his inspiration. The little girl who was playing Eva was quite ill with measles or something and was hardly able to play, so he asked me if I would like to take her place in the show next day. Would I? I would have given my life to. He told me that I must tell no one about it and also get my father's consent. That was difficult, he being away, but I was not to be thwarted in my ambition that day. So it cost me nearly every penny and play toy I owned to get my older sister to write a note saying it was all right and signing my father's name. They spent hours that afternoon and the next morning rehearsing me, and I don't think I told a soul in the village what was going on, except my sister. Anyway, I went on the next afternoon in the performance all painted up very white, and wore a blonde wig with long curls. My own hair they always kept cut short. I also wore the little girl's clothes that the part belonged to. It was her wig, too. And although they didn't fit very well, when I saw myself in the glass with my red lips and my long hair, I imagined I looked rather beautiful, and for the first time in my life I was pleased with the world and myself. I guess I must have gotten along all right through the matinee performance, for that night I was to play the part again, and I was so changed by the makeup that scarcely anybody in the audience had recognized me. But after the matinee, when minus wig and clothes, but with my face still painted, I appeared at the front door of the tent, I was recognized by the crowd and became quite the idol of the day. I absolutely danced through the entire village, heralding the fact that I was an actress. This news greeted my father when he arrived back home and found the three kids missing. There were very few small children at the night performance. The audience was composed mostly of grown-up people, and the youngsters that were there were too thrilled with the show to bother me much. However, every once in a while some urchin would holler at me, but I was too pleased with myself to notice it much, for I was acting right out with all my might and main. My father, on hearing the news, had rushed down to the tent. Maybe my escapade amused him. At any rate, he let me finish the performance, and although he was backstage, I didn't see him until the final tableau, which by the way ended in a large tragedy. I was standing on a step ladder behind a curtain that had a hole cut in it, which was veiled in with a piece of mosquito netting, and a spotlight was shining upon me. This conglomeration was meant to show little Eva's ascension to heaven. Everything was going lovely, and I was feeling thoroughly angelic, when I happened to glance down and saw my father standing in the entrance. This gave me such a start that I lost my balance, tumbled through the curtain down onto the stage below, and struck up a howl that nearly wrecked the opera. I guess my father must have felt sorry for me, because, strange to say, he didn't punish me, although he did make some terrible threats about what would happen to me in case I ever did attempt to act again. This little trip into the show business gave me a thrill that lasted all through my younger days and made me always wanting to be on exhibition. End of Part 2. Part 3 of Just Me by Pearl White. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. That same summer there was a county fair, and a man made an ascension in a balloon. He was dressed in pink tights, and performed on a trapeze during his flight upwards. He went up a good distance, and then cut some strings and descended gently to earth in a parachute. Seeing this man sailing up to the clouds gave me a great desire to go up in a balloon. That desire was fulfilled about 4 years ago, but unfortunately I was stranded for 3 hours and a half over New York City, and allow me to say that balloons in my life are finished. The parachute also made an awful hit with me, and it gave me the idea that I could make one for myself. My father had a large umbrella, and I figured if I should open it up and step off from some high building, I could take hold of the handle and descend to the earth a la parachute. Of course, I didn't figure that when the air got underneath the umbrella, it would turn inside out and leave me flat in the air. I finally got everything all set. The top of the old evaporator was chosen for the place from which I would make my descent. All of the kids in the village were notified, and I appointed my brother as manager of the affair. I sneaked the umbrella and dressed myself up in a long union suit that was to serve me as tights. I also swiped a red ribbon somewhere and tied that around my waist. This would have probably been my last trip on or to Earth, as the old building on the top of which I was poised must have been about 60 feet high. But I was all ready, umbrella in hand, and just going to step off when my father, who had seen so many boys hurrying in that direction, suspected that something was wrong, and arrived on the spot just in time to stop me. I was dragged away in high disgrace, hating my father and thinking he was all wrong. Some time afterwards I did try the stunt from a 10-foot building and was knocked out for hours. Ballooning was out, but I started to work on a trapeze. Every old broomstick and piece of rope I could find were converted into trapezes and hung from the rafters in the old evaporator. Thus, all the kids in the village, under my leadership, became acrobats. This was one thing my father didn't object to my brother and myself doing. Perhaps he thought it would develop our muscles, and the one thing he always adored was strength. From that time on, I can remember always having a broomstick strung up someplace until after I had my fall, and I have never been on a trapeze since. In those days in Missouri there were a lot of bandits, horse thieves, and highwaymen operating in a small way. Most of the famous gangs, like the James or Younger brothers, were of the past. But into the village this day rode a masked man at high noon, and armed with a revolver he entered the bank where the farmers kept their savings, held up the cashier, took the money, leaped on his horse and galloped away. I, with my brother, happened along the road just then. The cry of "Thief!" soon rang through the village, and a posse of men on horseback were soon on his trail. I think he was eventually caught and strung up, but that masked figure on horseback left a big impression on the minds of the village children. We were of the age when the boys start reading novels of bandits, pirates, etc. I always played with my brother's friends, wore my hair cut short, and was generally dressed in overalls. I looked like a boy and was called by all the nice little girls, "Tomboy." It was at this period that my stepmother gave birth to a child, so that we were more or less left to ourselves for a while. My brother and I established ourselves at the head of a tribe consisting of 14 roughneck boys, and called ourselves the Dalton Gang. We had read of them in a book. We built a shack and dug a cave under the ground floor of the old evaporator, which we stocked with everything we could lay our hands on. I think the gang must have lasted for nearly a year before we were discovered, and it took my father months finding the ownership of hundreds of dollars worth of booty that we kids had swiped. Perhaps we would not have been discovered had it not been for the Spanish-American War, which was going on at that time, and our attention was turned to warfare. I elected myself Admiral Dewey and my brother Admiral Schley. We ripped 2 old boilers out of the engine room of the old evaporator, turned them upside down, and set them up on each side of the little pond that stood behind it. These boilers were oblong, made out of sheet iron, with a large opening for fuel and a big smoke pipe. They must have been about 10 feet long, so that 7 or 8 kids could easily crawl inside of them. These 2 old boilers we christened the Maine and the Olympic. Our idea of warfare was comic enough because Dewey and Schley were both Americans, yet we fought bitter battles against one another. There was an old apple tree on our place, but although it bore lots of fruit, the apples were tasteless and they were never used. So we collected said apples and used them for cannon balls. Our warfare was thus: my followers got into my ship and my brothers into his. We each watched one another through small peepholes that we bored through the sides of the boilers. The trick was to raise up through the opening and throw apples at each other. When a boy stuck his head out of the other ship, we were all armed with said apples and threw them at him, making it a sort of dodge the baseball at Coney Island effect. My fleet was continually getting licked, so one day I collected secretly a lot of croquet balls and employed them to batter up a couple of boys in my brother's outfit. One poor little fellow was knocked out and hurt so badly that he had to be carried home. So his father and mine investigated the outfit and also discovered our cave with the plunder. From then on, the doors of the old evaporator were locked against us. We were severely punished and forbidden to enter the place again. The next event I remember in my life was the death of my stepmother's child. By this time I was getting rather religious. I had learned the 10 Commandments, and was more or less becoming a halfway decent child and a firm believer in "Thou shalt not steal." I also began to look upon myself as more or less grown up and to take things very seriously. I remember, very dramatic about my stepbrother's death. I cried the longest and sang the loudest of any one at the funeral. But I also remember that I hugely enjoyed the ride to the cemetery, which was a long way off. I don't suppose my grief was sincere, although I was very fond of the boy. The death of this child changed the future of the entire family. My stepmother refused to live any longer in the house in which her child had died. So the balance of the money in the family was taken by my father and invested in a business proposition in Springfield, Missouri. That was the place they had decided to settle in. Then I took my first train ride along with my parents and the two other children. My stepmother, it seemed, was very fond of animals, so we must have made a comic-looking bunch of emigrants when we left the old homestead. I was selected to mind 2 bird cages full of canaries. My brother had the cat in a cage along with a couple of guinea pigs, who, by the way, did not get along together at all well. My sister led the dog. I enjoyed that trip immensely, although it was hot weather and we traveled in a day coach. I must have, even at that age, had the spirit of adventure, for I was sorry when we landed in Springfield. My father had rented a beautiful house in a nice neighborhood, but he had only put into it a few chairs, not enough to go around, however, a couple of beds, and just enough dishes to cook our food in. He had intended to furnish the house after my mother arrived, but evidently the big return he had early expected from his investment was not realized, and we lived on in that large house for several months with bare walls, no carpets on the floors, and our food, which was very meager, was doled out to us mostly in our hands. I don't know what my father was doing. I think he was dabbling in real estate. However, I do know that whatever he did with the last of his money, it was lost. My brother got a job delivering newspapers, earning about $4 a week, and I think that we practically lived on that income for 3 or 4 months, the rent being paid in advance for that length of time. Then we left the big house and moved to a small one. My father got a job doing something or other, and piece by piece furniture was bought. I think it took nearly 4 years before an entire set of furniture was gotten together. My father worked hard, but he seemed to have had bad luck in everything he undertook, and whereas we always lived in a fairly good-looking house, we barely eked out an existence, and sometimes we hardly had enough to eat. My stepmother's pride was supreme. She never had anything to do with the neighbors because she was ashamed to let them come into our unfurnished home, and we children were never allowed to bring anyone in to play. In fact, our playtime was about over, and we all worked pretty hard the time we were out of school. My father did strive to give us an education. I remember my first 2 years at school in Springfield and my routine of work. My sister helped to do most of the housework, and I had to work outside. Every morning before school hours I used to get up and saw enough wood to last through the day, and my most vivid recollection of Springfield is the various woodsheds that belonged to the different houses in which we lived, for we moved quite often. I was the official woodcutter of our family up until a time I left home. My brother always had the job selling and delivering papers. In the Christmas holidays, my sister and I used to go out as cash girls in the stores, and in the summer vacation I used to get jobs outside. One I remember particularly was picking berries for the farmers. I worked one entire summer picking strawberries and blackberries on a farm. I used to walk there every morning carrying my lunch in a tin pail. If I worked very hard all day, bending over in the hot sun, I could make about 60 to 80 cents. I have afterwards learned that this place was in Nichols Junction, which is exactly 7 miles from Springfield. To walk that distance there and back in bare feet for 60 or 80 cents a day is not what you would call a good job. But I was fortunately very strong and healthy. Probably my hard work was responsible for that. I became quite a seamstress at an early age and used to make all of my own clothes. Another thing I was taught to do was to re-sole my own shoes, and although I was always barefoot in the summer, many are the soles that I tacked on in the winter. We invariably lived a long distance from school, and a nickel for car fare was far beyond our means. My brother and I were always pals. My sister was always quiet and very studious, for she, it was decided, should be a school teacher. My parents hadn't decided just what my brother and I should be. I was terribly grieved. I was about 12 years old at that time, when in the middle of one night my brother climbed out of his bedroom window, and without leaving even so much as a note behind, disappeared out into the world so completely that he was never heard of until he was 18. When he did return, it was only to tell us that he had joined the Navy and disappear again the same day. I never heard of him again until 3 years ago, when a most unusual thing happened between us, which I will deal with later on in the story. The loss of my brother was probably the first real grief that I ever felt, for in losing him I lost my best pal. I had always kept a trapeze hung out in the woodshed all of the time in Springfield, and spent most of my spare time performing on that. So eventually I became very capable in this line, and this made my venture into the circus business possible, which, by the same token, I had decided should be my fate in life. I used to hang around every circus and follow every parade that was ever pulled off in Springfield, and I always had 50 cents stored away waiting for the next one to come to town. It happened thus. I was just past 13. There was a carnival playing in the town, and of course I was there. A woman used to ride a diving horse off a 25-foot elevation into a tank of water each night. This was quite a stunt, and the carnival company offered, as an advertisement, that they would give a prize of $50 to anyone living in the town who could accomplish the same feat. I was one of the first applicants, but of course I was too young and they would not listen to my plea, and it was a good thing that they wouldn't, for if I had even been able to stick to the horse until I reached the water, I would surely have been drowned then. I was so persistent and hung around so much that I attracted the attention of one of the performers. I forget what her stage name was, but her real name was DeVere. She was doing a trapeze act as a ballyhoo in front of one of the sideshows. She was a regular circus performer and only filling in a couple of carnival dates before the regular circus season opened. This Mrs. DeVere took a great fancy to me because I happened to look like a son she had lost only a few months before, and of course I was so thrilled to be noticed by a performer that I would have given her my life. So we soon became very clubby. I told her my ambition, and one morning before the grounds opened, she let me work on the trapeze. I must have displayed some talent because she went to my father and offered to take me on tour with the Southern Circus. At first my father refused. Then, after many tears and much pleading on my part, he finally consented. Money being very scarce in our lives, besides it was vacation time and 2/3 of my pay was to be sent home each week. The rest was to go to Mrs. DeVere for looking after me. So I went with the circus, and my pay amounted to the large sum of $8 per week and board. I lived on the cars, as did all the circus people in those days, and the money, little as it was enough to send sister and myself to school for several years more. The people of the circus! I don't think there is a more whole-souled lot on earth, and I am certain that no bunch of people work harder than they. After the night performance, we packed up our tights and makeup and got on the cars, which were crowded enough, God knows, and along with the proverbial circus bees, cooties they are called since the war, we moved on to the next town, arrived the following morning. Then came the unloading, then the parade, then the matinee, then the night performance, and the same old thing over and over, day after day. Sundays were generally devoted to making long railway jumps. But as hard as the life is, a gayer lot of people never sat down to a royal banquet than these performers who gather around the large table set up under the kitchen tent. I think some of the better performers take their meals in hotels, but the majority never see any of the towns except while on parade. End of Part 3. Part 4 of Just Me by Pearl White. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How the circus gets into one's blood. I even to this day am more thrilled listening to a calliope or circus band than I could ever be with Sousa or even the opera. My career with the circus was not long lived, but oh how happy I was working with that act on traps, and the same time learning to be a bareback rider, which by the way is about the greatest ambition I ever had. One night I was doing a giant swing with only my right hand on the bar when several of the ligaments broke loose in my wrist and I fell. I don't know just what happened, but it seems that I struck the edge of the net below and bounced onto the ground, breaking my collarbone and my future as a circus performer. My wrist had to be strapped for several years, and my right hand even today is still very weak from that strain. The next 2 years were spent in school, and during vacation I worked in a printing office, feeding paper bags into a press which I worked with my foot, from 8 in the morning until 6 at night. All this for $4 a week. And besides, one day I forgot to take my hand out in time, this same right hand, and the press closed on it, crushing several of the bones. All during my printing office job career I nursed my theatrical ambition in silence, as my father had decided that an actress I should never be. I left school when I was 15. Then began the battle to outwit my father toward fulfilling my ambition. On the north side of Springfield there was a stock company in a theater called Deemer's. This company, also the theater, belonged to a doctor by that name. Dr. Deemer had, I think, made his money through a patent medicine called anti-grippine. About 4 rooms in the theater building he reserved for the purpose of packing these pills into boxes, filling mailing orders, etc. This is where I got in. There was a small printing office where their advertising circulars were printed. I must have applied for a job to run one of the presses about a dozen times before they took me on. As I had suspected, the theater programs were printed there also, and through a lot of persuasion with the foreman I was given charge of them. This brought me into contact with the manager and the director of the stock company. This company played 2 different plays each week, and their only matinees were Saturday and Sunday. I soon began to work myself into small parts, and as I also took care of my printing job, my father didn't seem to consider that as actually being on the stage. Besides, I made some extra money and even got my sister some small parts. Most parents have such wild and absurd ideas concerning the lives that people in the theatrical profession lead. How silly! As a matter of fact, most of us work too hard to have time to breed immorality in our minds. But to go back to my story. My father came around to the theater quite a bit and found out himself that actors were just human beings after all. I eventually got to play some very good parts once in a while, and I also took dramatic lessons in Shakespearean plays from a woman in the company, one Frances Field by name, who had at one time been with some important companies. Of course, like every other beginner, I dreamed of playing Juliet and Ophelia. I didn't display very much talent on the stage at first, but I was always very good about minding my own business and being on the job, and I certainly liked the work, so that helped some. It was pretty hard to go back to the press when the company closed for the 3 hot summer months. However, I sweated and fed into the machine, meaning printing press, endless sheets that sounded the praises of anti-grippine, Dr. Deemer's wonderful discovery to cure coughs, colds, grippe, and in fact most everything. At night I used to stitch weird creations that went to make up the theatrical wardrobe. One of these I shall always remember, as it played some important parts in this little narrative. This creation consisted of a short ballet skirt made out of yards and yards of red, white, and blue tarlatan, which was put together in layers. And when I kicked up a bit you saw red, white, and blue stripes. But I didn't stop there. The outside skirt was composed of red, white, and blue ribbons, the waist part out of blue satin with white stars sewed on, making the whole thing have the effect of an American flag. I guess the workmanship on this outfit was pretty crude, but it proved to be a good idea, for it helped me out of some pretty tight places. An audience must applaud the American flag even if the act is rotten. The next season I was nearly 17. Again the theatre opened, but the cast was composed of different artists than those who had been there the season before. I did get a couple of good parts, but it was very hard working day and night. Besides, the townspeople did not look upon me as a regular actress, and I did not get very much encouragement and applause from the audience. My last performance in Springfield ended in quite a catastrophe. I was playing Albert in Monte Cristo. Ye gods! How I loved that part. In the first act I wore a long black cape over boys' clothes of that period. The clothes were rented from a costumer in Kansas City, and how wonderful I felt swishing that cape about the stage. In the ballroom scene I had to fight a duel with old Monte Cristo himself. We used small buttons on the ends of the swords, and of course that lessened the danger of us being really cut. We had rehearsed this scene until we had gotten a pretty good fight framed up. For some reason I always fought with my mouth open. The first performance everything went off well, but the second, either I made a false move or he an unrehearsed thrust. Anyhow, he rammed the end of his sword into my open mouth, and I guess I must have bitten down on it, for as he pulled it out again, the rough edges on the button on the end of the sword took a hunk out of the inside of the roof of my mouth, which was followed by a stream of blood. I forgot where I was and burst into tears. My rage was so great that I pounced upon the poor leading man and entered into a free-for-all fist fight. I guess the poor fellow had to defend himself, and of course we wrecked the performance so badly that they had to ring down the curtain. But I didn't cease pounding poor old Monty until I was dragged away by a couple of stage hands. Believe me, I felt humiliated enough during the rest of the performance of that piece, and I didn't have much inclination to play Springfield again. One of the performers who had been in the company the season before had taken out a repertoire company this year, so I wrote asking him for a job, to which he answered that I could have one most any time I wanted to join them. I then contrived to get myself fired from my printing job also, and after a few weeks' idleness sprung the surprise on Father that I could get a job with the All-Star Stock Company at $15 a week. This was a lot of money then, so he let me go, and I joined the company in Memphis, Tennessee. I made the trip alone in a day coach. In those days I didn't know there was such a thing as a Pullman car. It was my first train trip alone, and I bought no end of candy from the butcher boy, arriving in Memphis very late at night with a pretty weak stomach. The All-Star Stock Company was a traveling company playing 1 week in each town, a different play each night. I played not very important parts in that company, under the name of Maisie Hall. Between the acts they put on singing and dancing turns, which were called specialties. I was, of course, at every performance compelled to trip out in one of these. Now I always had a good clear voice that could carry a tune in a way, but it certainly was devoid of music, and my dancing, oh, that was awful. But still I danced. The red, white, and blue dress went fine when I sang patriotic numbers, but the only thing that would furnish an excuse for the short, full skirt was that I do a skirt dance for an encore. It's a good thing that I had the American flag to protect me through this spasm. Even that failed in one town. The whole company were none too clever, and when we struck one town in Mississippi, Natchez by name, dancing was cut out of my stage career forever. It was Thursday, and we had been playing the town since Monday, and by the way were not much of a success. Hence it seems that this night some of the audience came armed. I don't know whether the plot had been framed up against me or not. Anyway, this was my red, white, and blue night. It certainly turned out blue for me. The grand old rag had gone very well, and a goodly bit of applause burst forth. Then I started to dance. I heard something land on the stage behind me with an awful smack, followed by a lot of giggling in the front of the house. But on I danced. As I gave one extra high kick, some article was thrown onto the stage and landed under my one foot that was resting on terra firma. This gave me an awful skid, and I landed in a sitting down position with a terrible thud. Then came another missile whizzing over my head. Horrors! They were throwing rotten eggs at me. Oh, the mortification I suffered that night, for I was taking myself very seriously in those days. This company lasted about 2 months and then stranded down in South Carolina. However, I had saved up nearly $60, which seemed quite a fortune. It was in Charleston, South Carolina. I was stopping with a private family, as in those days about $5 per week for room and board was the absolute limit. Consequently, the hotels were beyond me, and I always stayed in boarding houses or private homes. This family was very nice to me. The father was a purser on a passenger boat running from New York to Cuba, and he came home for several days while I was there. Now, to go back to Springfield would have put an awful hole in my bankroll, so I was all for getting a job that would not cost me railroad fare to reach. He told me that he would get me a job as stewardess on board his boat. Wonderful! I could go out onto the ocean and see a bit of the world. It was on board that little boat that I first realized how foul one's stomach can treat you. Seasickness! My job consisted of emptying the slop jars and straightening up the cabins. It seems there was nothing I was commissioned to do that didn't require stooping over, and this was the one thing that my stomach wouldn't stand for. Luckily, that was a short trip, because I had begun to crave death by the time we landed in Havana. So I took my suitcase, and with the promise to be back in time for the return trip, I left a week's wages and the boat flat. Now, my advice to any young girl who is searching for a career is, don't go to Cuba. I soon found that out. I, armed with the trusty red, white, and blue, soon got a job in a variety hall, but to have done that without speaking any Spanish at all was quite a trick. However, I shortened my skirt a little more and sang American songs to a lot of applause. I was then calling myself simply Miss Maisie. Most of the audience understood not what I sang. Perhaps it was better so, and maybe they were only applauding the American flag. Needless to say, I did not dance. I stayed there about a month, and when I had all of the money that I had saved out of my earnings translated into American money, it came to nearly $200. My salary was not large. Oh, no. But it was customary then for Cubans, if they liked a performer, to toss coins upon the stage for an encore, and allow me to say that I went sour on many a high note picking up the odd pesos. I found fault not with Cuba, nor with the pennies I was gaining, but with the men who inhabit the island. I had never had any amount of attention paid to me by the male sex before. Somehow I was not the type that men fall for. But these Spanish boys, mother of mercy! They trailed me through the streets, chattering in their weird language of which I understood nothing. Perhaps they were harmless and were only trying to borrow money or something. Anyway, I flattered myself I was being chased. Being an American and quite fair, along with my production of homemade clothes, which I must admit were pretty wild, for in those days I loved a lot of colors mixed together. Perhaps the poor fellows, after all, were only handing themselves a lot of laughs. I had been told by a troupe of acrobats working in the same theater with me that South America was the place that I should descend upon, that the people there appreciated talent and were much more refined than were the Cubans. Of course they were kidding me, but I fell for it and started for South America. Buenos Aires was to be my goal. I dipped into my savings and bought my transportation. The rest of the money I firmly sewed in a chamois bag, which I hung around my neck, and departed for South America, with a third-class ticket in one hand and a Spanish, self-taught method book in the other. The steerage! Suffering cats! I don't see why the laws that govern humanity allow people to travel in such discomfort. To be seasick, which they all are, is bad enough, but to be chucked in with a lot of people speaking a lot of different languages and you can't tell whether they are talking to you or about you is too awful. I landed in Buenos Aires on my 17th birthday, which is a rather tender age to be so far away from home. However, I was as tall as I am now and looked at least 23 or 4. In fact, when I was 19, my photographs showed that I looked older than I do even today. Buenos Aires is more or less just a big cosmopolitan city, and I felt small and frightened enough when I landed there. Although you do find quite a few English-speaking people, the majority are Latin and stick to their respective native tongues. If in Cuba I was a small riot, in South America they didn't even know I was there. I did get several weeks' work in the music halls, but I got so terribly lonesome and even homesick that I parted with most of my bankroll. I also sold the trusty red, white, and blue to an American girl I met there, and got passage on a freight boat going to New Orleans. Thank God there was no steerage on that boat, or I guess I would have drawn it. The trip was a long, rough one, and in the spring of the year the Gulf Stream certainly can behave pretty nasty. Of course I was seasick, and we ran into an awful storm which threw the boat out of its course for several days. I lay in my bunk, felt the boat rock, saw the waves come in the door, thought of the old song, "Rocked in the Cradle of the Deep," and decided that mine was meant to be a watery grave. So with the fear of God still in my heart, I arrived in New Orleans a pretty sick person and boarded a train bound towards home. My money was absolutely exhausted by the time I reached Memphis, Tennessee, and when, by the way, I passed through the station there, I was not the same happy girl that I was when I stepped off the train at that same station some months earlier to join the All-Star stock. I made the rest of the trip to Springfield without eating anything except an apple, which was given to me by a lady on the train who had a lot of lunch done up in a box. I was a sorry looking sight when I stepped off at the station in Springfield, but I was too tired and hungry to nurse my pride. So with my battered old suitcase in hand, I walked to my father's house, over a mile away, and fairly fell in the door. What a success I had turned out to be. Now my family was never a hysterical one, but as they received no news from me during my tour of the foreign countries, they had a lot of angry emotion stored up that they immediately spilled. End of part 4. Part 5 of Just Me by Pearl White. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. My father then decided that my theatrical days were surely at an end, that he was not going to have his daughter disgracing him, and all the things that parents can say and think about the stage. So he mapped out my career from then on. I, he decided, showed signs of talent toward being a dressmaker, and he, himself, got me a job as an apprentice. I lived at home and went to the dressmaker's house each morning. My training consisted of stitching endless seams on the sewing machine. Then I got to delivering bundles and eventually helped to do the housework in the dressmaker's home. I worked there for 4 months at $4 a week and learned nothing. I didn't want to be a dressmaker anyway, and when I got fired, I guess my father didn't care much himself. My next job was as a nurse girl to 3 children. My father knew the family in which I worked, so that I wasn't treated as a regular servant and took my meals with them. Now such things as olives, sweetmeats, all the butter and sugar one wanted had been a scarcity in my life, and this family, who were very well off, set a wonderful table. Consequently, I did a lot of very important eating and very little work. As a nurse girl, I was a terrible failure. I was waiting patiently for my 18th birthday, which eventually arrived. In February, I began answering advertisements in the New York Clipper, a theatrical paper that carries advertisements for traveling companies to fill up vacancies that might occur in their casts. I finally landed a job through an agency in Kansas City and was to join the troupe on the 4th of March, that being the day on which I was to become 18. The troupe had sent me a railroad ticket and my trunk I had secretly sent to the station. At about 11 o'clock of the night of the 3rd of March, I made the announcement to my family that at 12 it would be the 4th, and that I would be of age to go where I pleased. Therefore, I was departing on the 1:30 train. My father did act like a sportsman this time. He simply said, "Well, girl, I have lost. I have tried to change your mind and failed. Therefore, I can but wish you good luck." My stepmother also loosened up and actually kissed me with feeling, telling me not to forget that, humble though it was, I had a home to come back to when I didn't get on out in the world. This was, I think, the first real demonstration of affection that had ever been staged in my family circle, and I was not an entirely happy young woman when I boarded that train bound for Galena, Kansas, to join the Trousdale Stock Company. This was also a traveling repertoire company. I lasted with this show about 8 weeks and then was fired. It seems that I simply didn't make good. This was quite a blow to me, but I was determined not to return home until I had become a success. So I was left in Emporia, Kansas, flat and alone with precious little money in my possession. I still stuck to the name of Mazie. However, I had taken on my last name as White. I just more or less moped around that town for a few days, not knowing what to do. Then the old courage returned and I decided that I would not be beaten. I began to change myself, thinking that maybe my makeup was all wrong. I got together some photographs of famous actresses and tried to copy them. In the first place, I had always hated my hair, so I dyed it jet black. Please let me announce to the girls, if you want to get in wrong, just try doing it yourself. I had all the furniture dotted with black, and my hands and neck were dark for weeks. However, I afterward mastered the art and for 2 years kept my hair dyed. I was very pleased with this first step. I had a lot of hair too, so I piled it up into the largest pompadour possible. Then I started using powder on my face and black on my eyebrows. Up until that time I had never used paint or powder when out of the theater. Now I decided I should be very pale, and as my cheeks were always very red, I even put liquid white on them to hide the color. I then got a very tight corset and pulled in my waistline a la Anna Held. I also lengthened my skirts until they touched the ground. And to myself I looked like a regular actress, but to others I must have looked terribly foolish, because nearly every person I passed on the street, during my first promenade, turned around for a second look. Of course I was delighted and thought I must look stunning. Why can't we always remain young and foolish? I had known an actor from the old Deemer stock days by the name of Frederick Rella. He had started a stock company in an airdrome built by the local band boys of Coffeyville, Kansas. This was only a short way from Emporia, so I decided to descend upon him in my new makeup and ask for a job. If I could only have foreseen the tragedy that awaited me there. I arrived in Coffeyville, left my trunk at the railroad station, went to a boarding house nearby and engaged a room under my real name, Pearl White, the name I have stuck to ever since. When I went down to the theater I received the sad news that Mr. Rella had been taken seriously ill the day before and was now unconscious. The stage manager told me that they had enough people to get along with, and he didn't want to engage anyone else until Mr. Rella got well again. So I stayed on in Coffeyville answering advertisements and trying to get a job. I was there about 3 weeks waiting and reading The Life of Napoleon over and over again. Napoleon, he who suffered, thought and fought during his early manhood, was my example. He who made his almost impossible dreams come true gave me courage to keep up my struggle. Finally I landed a job with another stock company. They sent me a ticket, but as I only had $1.75 in my pocket and owed $4 to the rooming house keeper, I was in quite a fix. I went to the landlady and told her the situation I was in, and begged her to let me go on and join the company, and that I would send her the money out of my first pay, to which she consented. So I took my suitcase in hand and started to catch the 8:30 train to Shawnee, Oklahoma. I reached the station, waited about 10 minutes for the train, and just as it loomed upon the horizon, I was tapped on the shoulder by a policeman. It seems that the old landlord, who had entered the hotel just a moment after I had gone, had different ideas about letting guests depart without paying their bills, and he had brought down the law upon my unsuspecting shoulders. I was mortified and frightened out of a year's growth. I tried to argue with the cop that everything was all right, and then if I missed the train, what it meant to me. He wasn't interested, and said I could tell that to the landlord himself. So I left my suitcase in the station and was escorted through the streets by a policeman, who had given me the choice of going quietly or forcibly. Just what would have happened had not a good Samaritan come to my rescue, I know not. Be that as it may. A man who ran another little theater in the town saw me walking along the street with the law, and followed us into the presence of the irate innkeeper. He listened to my monologue and offered to pay the bill, saying I could afterwards return the money to him, trusting to my honesty as I had nothing to leave as security. I can truthfully say that the first $4 I received was sent to him with more than the ordinary amount of gratitude. Well, this proposition was accepted by the rooming house people, and I was allowed to depart. My rescuer walked back to the station with me, but as that was the last passenger train that night, the depot was closed, with my suitcase and trunk locked up inside of it. I had checked the trunk and had the receipt for it, but not so with the trusty old suitcase. I tried to get hold of the station master, but he had departed to parts unknown. I was in a fine mess. There was a freight train that stopped there at 12:30 and carried a few passengers in the caboose, but that was not patronized very often, and the station house did not open up for that train. However, I decided to take it, and my rescuer promised to have the ticket agent send me my baggage on the first train the next morning. I rode on the merry old freighter most of the night, then changed and got a passenger train the rest of the way. Now this company I was to join was just being organized, and when I landed in Shawnee, the manager, having met the train before on which I was expected, had given me up as lost. So I stepped off the train very much alone, without even a change of clothing, and, worse luck, I had left the slip of paper on which I had the manager's name written in my suitcase that was reposing back in Coffeyville. I trudged up to the hotel, but being without baggage, they demanded their money in advance. I was in pretty bad. I had a hard time even getting the man at the desk to lend me his ear while I slipped him the news that I was to join the troupe. But owing to the fact that they were not playing as yet, he knew of them not, and probably thought I was more or less of a nut. However, he eventually opened up and told me that there was a young fellow stopping in the house that was suspected of being an actor. Of course, it was my luck he was out just then, so I planted myself on a chair and waited about 3 hours for his return. I was getting pretty nervous when a youth walked into the hotel, who couldn't have been more than 18 and had no earmarks, such as long hair and extreme clothes that performers went in for in those days. Anyway, the clerk said something to him and pointed toward me. I was fit to be tied by that time, and wouldn't have been surprised if he had turned out to be a warden from an insane asylum coming to fetch me. I told him my tale, and he was of the troupe which I was to join. He took me around to the manager, and I got enough money advanced to get into a hotel, but I wasn't very comfortable without even a clean handkerchief. I was expecting my luggage on the next train, but it didn't come, nor did it on the next, nor the next. I did receive a duplicate check for the suitcase. A woman in the company was kind enough to lend me enough linen to get along with, and I stuck to the one suit that I brought in on my back. The trunk finally arrived after about a week, but the suitcase, no. Then the wonderful idea dawned on me that if it were really lost, the express company would have to pay me $150, and that was a lot of money to me. I would have sold it and its contents very willingly for 25. Well, the company started on a tour, but it didn't last very long, so that I didn't get any money at the beginning, because they had to take out my railroad fare and give me my board money in advance. Therefore, I was always a little ahead of my salary. We landed in Parsons, Kansas. I was just out of debt, and with my $15 worth of salary coining that Saturday night, things looked pretty bright. The time was also up in which the express company was due to deliver the suitcase or pay the 150, which I was looking forward to with great anticipation. But gosh hang it! On Friday the old bag showed up, a little worse off for its traveling around the country, but still intact. On Saturday night, after the performance, we marched out to the box office to get our salary, and found that the manager had disappeared with the weekly receipts in his pocket. What grief! I think I had about 10 cents in the world, with which I bought postage stamps and sent out appeals for a job, among which was one to the Coffeyville Stock Company. That was immediately answered, sending me a ticket and telling me to come right away. So I left my trunk for my board bill and bid farewell to the boy of the hotel lobby episode in Shawnee. We'd become wonderful pals, and I hated to say goodbye. He was only a youngster then, but some years afterward he became quite a favorite in the moving picture plays produced by the Lubin Company. This boy's name is Earl Metcalf. He was getting along very well in his profession, but he proved that he was more than just an artist, and was one of the first men to go to the Plattsburgh training camp, and went over to Europe in one of the first contingents sent from America. 6 months ago he was a lieutenant. I have heard since that he has become a captain. I hope he comes back a general. Well, I played in Coffeyville about 5 weeks and got a few dollars ahead. Then Mr. Rella died and the company closed, and I attended my second funeral, but unlike my first, I was so affected that I saw his dead face before me in the darkness for days, and have since been to only 2 funerals. I don't look upon death with fear now, but in my early youth I certainly did. After a couple of days I got a job with a company in a town nearby, Topeka, Kansas. But the show closed the day after I joined. The next company that broke into the town was the Trousdale stock, the same company on which I had been fired before. The woman they had taken on in my place was evidently not so good either, so they discharged her and took me back. Now this show didn't last so very long, but I got my salary and a wonderful thrill on the opening and closing nights. There is an insane asylum in Topeka. I don't know whether it was the character woman's idea or mine. Anyhow, we decided we'd go out and pay said asylum a visit. We'd gone through the building and started to go away when I spied a lot of women out in the little yard. They were some trusted inmates who were not watched very closely, and they did prove themselves to be less crazy than we. I had on, I remember, a bright red dress, and she had on a picture hat with a couple of green plumes in it. These bright colors must have made an impression on the crowd, because they all gathered around us and began to chatter and laugh. One woman walked up, whom we took to be a nurse. She was doing some very fine embroidery work, and talked very nicely to us, telling us not to mind the other women, that they were all nuts. Then, with a remark that she loved my red dress, she left us, and started bawling out the others. Just then a real nurse came up and told us that visitors were not allowed in that part of the grounds. She also told us that the woman to whom we were just talking was insane and very violent at times. Gee! They were getting me all fussed up by now, and I didn't have much faith in anybody's sanity, even my own. So we started to get out. There was an awful howl, and the woman with the fancy work leaped into the air and started toward me. I lost no time in ducking behind a high bench, but she was right on my heels and chased me around in circles until she was captured by 2 attendants. End of part 5. Part 6 of Just Me by Pearl White. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Then the attendants began lining the bunch up to take them back into the house. Well, we wanted to see no more of it, so we started for the gate. On the way, my pal slipped me the information that you must never run from a crazy person. "Stop and look them straight in the eye," she said. But the eye was hardly out of her mouth when I caught a wicked look from my woman of the chase, and I didn't hesitate, but broke into a marathon. She, with another shriek, broke away from the attendants and started in hot pursuit after me, the character woman in the rear shouting, "Look her in the eye." You can bet I didn't look back, but kept right on toward the trolley car that was to take me home. I must have made a wonderful sprint, because when I leaped on the car, I glanced back and my pursuer was a good ways behind, and had evidently given up the chase, for she was starting back. I noticed the people in the car sort of all moved away from me, and also that the car didn't start. I was probably so scared that I was getting hysterical, but it dawned on me that the people in the car had seen the wild dash and took me for an escaped lunatic. I broke out with a hysterical laugh, and two men got up, each seizing me by an arm, and began to pacify me and to force me out of the car. Of course, I put up an awful argument, but out I went. They dragged me back toward the asylum. Now the woman who had been chasing me was quietly walking back with an attendant who in turn had been chasing her. My friend was sauntering along toward the gate, gaily swinging her mesh bag and laughing at me. Then the mad woman again broke loose and started toward her. She stopped and with her arms akimbo prepared to look said mad woman straight in the eye. I don't guess that's a good stunt because it didn't turn out so well. The crazy woman leaped forward and grabbed herself a green plume, but evidently it was tacked on pretty tight to the hat, and the hat pinned to the false hair of my friend. Anyway, off came the hat, transformation and all, and the poor old woman dropped to the ground in a clumsy mess and passed out of the picture. Now the asylum attendants were busy taking care of the mad woman, so I was left flat with the two men holding me who were just coming to themselves. So they dragged me into the asylum to claim the credit for having captured an escaped lunatic, meaning me. Of course, the authorities told them their mistake immediately, and I was allowed to go on my way, collecting my swooning friend en route to the streetcar. When we arrived back to our rooms, we were in a nice state of nerves and were advised by some of the members of the company to take a hooker of gin. Now Mr. Gordon's gin and I had never met before, so consequently I was leading a nice little bun around that night when the performance started. I was playing Madge, in Old Kentucky. We used a horse in this opera, but said horse didn't travel with us. They picked up one in each town that we played. The horse that I drew this night had never acted before. I was in the third act climax, dressed up in jockey's clothes, supposedly to have just won a big race. They led the horse onto the stage for the curtain, amid cheers from stage hands and supers for a curtain call. Now this night I was not too steady. The electric lights were more or less dancing before me, and I must have slipped too far back on the horse's hips when the orchestra struck up "My Old Kentucky Home." The curtain started to descend, the horse bucked, and I was pitched over his head out into the audience, landing in an old man's lap. I wasn't hurt, but was so scared and surprised that I was only about semi-conscious. There was a little flight of stairs going up onto the stage, so I made for this. There were only about 6 steps, but I was taking no chances, and I climbed up these stairs on my hands and knees. The audience began to howl with laughter, and I couldn't imagine what was the matter until I reached the stage and found that the fall had been too big a strain on my satin jockey pants, and going up the stairs on my hands and knees, with my back to the audience, they had made the discovery before I did. This was a bad opening with the company, but everything went on quietly after that, and we played on until the airdrome circuit closed in September. Our last date was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but we got an offer for a special date and decided to stick together for another week to play that. Now, in a place about 20 miles from Tulsa, I think the place was called Kiefer, Indian Territory, oil had just been struck, and there were about 5,000 miners already settled there in tents, there being about only 5 frame buildings in the settlement. The few streets that had been laid out were flooded with oil, and you had to walk on planks to keep your feet dry. These miners were unable to have their families with them until places could be built for them to live in, so they were naturally very lonesome and keen for amusement. They had put up a large tent and were engaging traveling companies to show there for a week at a time. Well, we landed there. We were getting along fine and playing to a lot of customers. Up until Friday we had put on comedies, but that night we slipped on a melodrama. The heavy man had a dirty part to play, and he received more than the usual amount of hissing. We heard next day that he had been discussed by the miners, and they had come to the conclusion that he must be a pretty bad guy even in private life, because he was so mean on the stage. Saturday night came, and we didn't have any comedies left, so we had to put on another knockdown and drag them out mellow. The miners, having just gotten their pay and having no work to do on Sunday, elected that night to get drunk. We had reached the third act, and the villain was then pretty bad. In the climax he had to throw a woman across the stage, then stand over her with clenched fists and call her a lot of foul names. He had uttered only one of these when a man in the audience rose up and shouted, "You skunk, to hit a woman! If you want to fight, do it with someone your size." Then, after a good deal of profanity, he offered to enter into a fist combat with him himself, promising to knock the villain's block off and a few other things. But said villain was all for peace, so he ducked behind the scenes. Then someone fired a shot at his retreating figure, and this started a riot. Most of the men were with their fellow miner that there should be a battle pulled off. Now the woman in the play, who had received the rough handling, got up from the floor and shouted to the piano player, "Jake, play 'My Country 'Tis of Thee,'" which Jake promptly did. But either he was a key too low or she was a key too high. Anyway, they were certainly not together. This quieted the mob for a couple of minutes, and she was just starting to hit it right with the piano player, when her 2 children, who had up until then been sleeping in a dressing room, struck up an awful howl. So she dashed into them, fearing some awful crimes were being committed. Then came my chance to be a hero. I galloped out and begged for a moment's attention. "Now," said I know that you're all gentlemen and will listen to a sporting proposition." "We're all gents," said they, "and can pay attention to a lady any time." So I told them that I was with them in my dislike for the villain. In fact, so was all the company, and as we were closing the show that night, we didn't care much what happened to him. "But," I went on, "if you will keep your seats and let us resume with the last act, when that has been finished you can use the theatre to pull off a fight in." "Sounds fair enough," said the man with the revolver, and turning it on the others, said, "Sit down when a lady asks you to, 'cause if you don't there's going to be a couple of ginks taking a short cut to hell." Well, they quieted down and we continued. Now at the finish of the last act, the villain was to be led on handcuffed, but when we came to that, he had departed for parts unknown. The miners got awful mad, and we got awful scared when they rushed up on the stage demanding the villain's body, dead or alive. We told them it wasn't our fault if he was a coward and had beat it. They searched around, and of course they couldn't find him. Then one of the company, whom I told of his whereabouts, said he had seen him start out on a run toward the hotel. So part of the gang started in pursuit, while the others stayed on and volunteered to help us pack up. All of this time, though, there were only a few old dresses between our villain and death. I had put him into an old wicker hamper that was only about 4 feet long. He was about 6. He did not fit very well, but he was for doing his bit toward disappearing, and folded himself up into the basket and let me back some clothes on top of him. I didn't lock the hamper, so during the search it was never suspected, and nobody bothered to lift up the clothes. It must have been pretty tough on the poor villain when the lid was eventually locked with not too much air, and a sneeze or a cough would surely have cost him his life. We loaded our goods and chattels on a wagon at midnight and were to get a train at 2 in the morning. This train didn't stop in this town unless it was previously arranged with the railroad company. We had that fixed up, however, and as the station wouldn't open, we had to load our baggage on ourselves. So about 50 of the most gallant drunk miners announced they would stick around and see us off. Well, it was 2 hours until train time, but we were all for getting down to the station and waiting on the platform for the train. Said station was only a little shack. Down we went with our little escort. The comedian of the troupe, telling jokes and singing odd songs, made himself the pet of the miners that night. I was watching the basket that contained our villain. It had been loaded on the wagon very carefully by 2 men of our company, but when the wagon had gotten to the station, the gang declared that our troupe had worked hard enough and unloaded our baggage themselves. Of course, they set the hamper on one end, and I was trying to figure out which end the fellow inside was resting on. It worked out he must be on his head, so I corralled the leading man and we turned it over with the pretense that we wanted to use it as a seat. Then everybody in our troupe sort of grasped the meaning of this act and took turns sitting on the basket, beating a tattoo with their feet, so as to give the poor fellow inside a chance to turn over. Then the posse that had started in pursuit toward the hotel joined us, with the news that they couldn't find their man. "Maybe it's better so," said the leader of the mob, "because to preserve our honor as gents we would have to shoot him, and I don't think the cuss is really worth the bullets that we would have to drive into his hide." It was getting very cold, and the miners' liquor was dying out a bit. Some were drifting away, but a goodly amount stuck, and when one of the children began to cry because he was cold, a man with a long red beard rose up and volunteered to make a bonfire. Then a couple of miners pulled out a few loose ties from a side track, covered them with coal oil, and started a fire. This was a new thrill for the miners, and they started dancing and yelling about it. Before long they had a huge fire and nearly all of the side tracks ripped up. Somebody must have thought of the poor fellow in the hamper, so they carried it over by the fire. But in the excitement, when the train was heard approaching, everybody apparently forgot about it, and the poor fellow inside darn near roasted before he was slung onto the baggage car. The fire by that time had grown quite large and was catching on to the corner of the station house, but someone yelled, "Let her burn! We'll give the folks a good send-off." And by the time we got our trunks on the train, the whole building was burning, and the last I saw of it as we steamed out into the night was a lot of drunken men yelling and doing an Indian dance around a big blaze which spelt the last of that little frame shack. We told the story to the conductor and got our man out of the hamper. Then the whole troupe gave a sigh of relief and laughed or cried as their temperaments demanded. My next job was with a company called Eldon's Comedians, but evidently we were not very funny, for we only lasted a couple of weeks. So I, having some cash on hand, hit the trail for Chicago. The first office I went to belonged to the firm of Rowland and Clifford, located in the old Grand Theatre building. I walked in about 10 in the morning and asked to see Mr. Rowland. He stuck his head out of his private office and said, "Come in," and in I went. "Want an engagement?" he asked. "I would like to exhibit my talents in one of your companies," answered I. "Can you play Jane Eyre?" he asked. "Just my line," I retorted. I hadn't the slightest idea what the part was like. Then he continued, "You start rehearsals at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Your salary will be $25 a week, and if you make good, I'll star you. Good morning." Good morning, glory! I saw it before me, $25, and I would have taken it for 15. I hustled out and bought a book of Jane Eyre, and spent that night reading it. I rehearsed for a week and opened as a star, in Roland and Clifford's Western Company of Jane Eyre, playing mostly one night stands. I'll never forget the thrill I had when I first saw my name in electric lights in front of a theater. It was in East St. Louis, and we were playing there 3 days. I got a room right across the street from the theater, so I could see that sign, "Pearl White in Jane Eyre." How happy I was that season. I saved up some money and the show lasted until spring. End of part 6. Part 7 of Just Me by Pearl White. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. But my star soon hid behind a cloud. The company closed and I went to join a company playing stock in Minneapolis. When I got off the train I felt pretty bad and I was sick for 2 weeks. That was my first introduction to a physician. My father had always believed in home remedies. And when this doctor wanted to cut out my appendix, I decided to take a Pullman and go home to Father. However, I felt so well when I got to Kansas City that I decided I'd go to New Orleans instead. That was a long trip and cost me a lot of money, but there I went and stayed on a week or more. It was in New Orleans on Canal Street that I saw my first moving picture. Moving pictures had been quite popular for some time then, but somehow I had never seen one. I then joined a troupe. I don't know that it had a regular name, but the company was owned by a man named Al Beasley, who had a wife named Sarah, who was an awfully good sort. I joined them in Biloxi, Mississippi, where I took my first dip in the salt water. We had played to very bad business for 3 or 4 weeks, and the company had dwindled down to 5 people besides the manager and his wife. But with 7 people there were enough plays that we could put on, so we decided to stick together and work on the Commonwealth plan, which means everybody shares alike in the profits, until fall, when Mr. Beasley had a contract to put a company into the Maryland Theater in Cumberland, Maryland. Oh, what a time we had reaching there. We were always just 1 step ahead of the sheriff all the way. We were playing in Scranton, Mississippi, to very good patronage. The theater was an open-air affair, sitting in a park by the side of the ocean, and we stopped up the beach about 1/4 of a mile in a great big boarding house. We were to about Friday of our stay in that town when an awful storm came up after the night performance. We sat out on the front porch and watched the storm on the ocean, thinking it a beautiful sight. But next morning, when we heard that part of the theater and some of our trunks had been washed out to sea, we rushed down to view the disaster, and all the beauty went out of our lives. Some of our wardrobe was intact, but a good portion was being battered about in the waves. We rescued all that we could of the wreck, but the missing particles put an awful dent into our outfit. We struggled on for some more weeks and landed in Anniston, Alabama, where business bucked up so well that we each got about $200. Fortunately, or unfortunately as it may have been, we ran into a fire sale there. A big clothing store had been partly burned and all the goods slightly damaged, but they were selling their clothing so cheap and we needed them so badly that we all spent our money in getting ourselves dressed up in new outfits. We continued on tour looking fit at least. We could never seem to get more than just enough money to pay our board and get to the next town, but we did have a good night in one other little town in Alabama. We were doing what they call in the show business wildcatting, which means booking your show as you go along and playing anywhere at all. We arrived in this little town, I've forgotten its name, and there didn't seem to be more than 12 houses, along with a drugstore, grocery store, and post office. There wasn't even an hotel. We were to play in the schoolhouse about a mile from the station. We got some crackers and sardines from the village grocer and ate them on the steps. This was our dinner. Then, with our clothes and makeup in our handbags, we started for the Opry. The bell on said Opry, or schoolhouse, started ringing at about 7:30 and continued for an hour. That is how the farmers were notified that a show was in town. This house was in the woods, and where the people came from I know not, but by 8:45 the house was packed at $1.50 a shot. This was our last successful town, and we finally got so bad that we had to have our fare advanced by the theatre in the next town in which we were to play. Still, we stuck together until we went absolutely on the rocks. Then Sarah dug down somewhere and got enough pennies to take us into Cumberland. We enlarged our troupe and played to very good business for a few weeks, but the man who owned the theatre was very enthusiastic about running moving pictures in the theatre instead of a stock company, so we had to quit. Now, Helene Hamilton was a woman in our company who had been in New York many times, and she told me that was the place for me because the season was just starting. It was then September. So to New York I came, armed with a list of managers' names and the address of a rooming house on 88th Street. I dressed myself in a green velvet suit and a large hat trimmed with a bunch of artificial grapes that I had picked up at the fire sale in Anniston. They were a little faded when I drew them, so I carefully gilded them with gold paint, and allow me to say that that hat was certainly a dream to me then, but as I remember it now, it was awfully comic. I landed on the Jersey side and came across the 23rd Street ferry, the same place that I take the boat for the studio each morning now. I got a room for $3 a week and for 2 days spent my time going to shows. I saw several Broadway stars in different plays and awoke to the fact that in a New York company I would be willing to take a very small part and forget my one-night stand stardom. In fact, I would have given my soul to play on Broadway, but evidently no manager wanted either that or my services, for I fought my way into the big producers' offices. I even got to see Charles Frohman himself, but a job on Broadway I couldn't get. So, as I was never for sitting idle, I took a job with a stock company, playing a month in Asbury Park, then 5 months in South Norwalk, Connecticut. About the end of January, my voice began to go bad. I was playing in a lot of bloody melodramas, and I guess reaching the old-time rip-roaring climaxes caused me to strain my vocal cords. A woman who had played in pictures came in from New York one week to play an engagement with our company. She suggested that I try pictures and give my voice a rest. She gave me a list of the different companies and their addresses. Now, moving pictures held no fascination for me, but I decided that I would try to get a little work in some of the studios until my voice got better. I gave my notice to the company, and on Tuesday of my finishing week, I came to New York and started out to find a job in the movies. The first studio on my list was Edison. The directions read, "Take 3rd Avenue elevated to the end, get off, walk down the stairs, and you can easily find the studio about a block away." Now the 3rd Avenue elevated is a long line, and of course I didn't stop to figure that there were 2 ends. So naturally I took the wrong one. I must have gotten a downtown train and landed way down at the Brooklyn Bridge, where I spent the afternoon searching for said Edison studio. Eventually I found out that it was on the uptown end, way up in the Bronx, but I had to get back to South Norwalk, so I called it a day. I came back again on Thursday and took the second studio on the list, Calum, 19th Street. Mr. Theodore Wharton was the head director there at that time, so I got an audience with him and he asked from whence I came. I told him I was playing in South Norwalk, but my voice by now was almost a whisper and he didn't believe my story. He directed me several years afterward in The Exploits of Elaine. Then he told me that at our first meeting he had taken me to be just a girl from a little upstate town who wanted to become an actress. But he said that something in my personality, for some reason or other, made him want to help and advise me. So that day, there in his office on 19th Street, he told me that I should go back to my home, because that any part of the theatrical profession was a tough game to buck, and a whole lot of other fatherly advice stuff. I sat tight that day and let him rave on. I probably had seen more hard knocks in show business than he ever had. Anyway, I didn't want to spoil his illusion, so I played up the situation and promised that I'd go back home to my folks. Again, I came to New York on Friday and tackled the third on the list, Powers, 241st Street. That was a long drill on the subway and surface cars, but I finally reached there, and the director, Joseph A. Golden, took me seriously and told me he could give me a try at $5 a day, and that I could start working the following Monday. So back to South Norwalk I went, packed up my goods, and came to New York to stay. I did my first picture in 2 days. They were only doing one reel pictures then, and they gave me a steady engagement at $30 a week. I had gone on about 3 weeks before I saw my first picture on the screen. Oh, what a sensation that is! Up until that time I had a mental picture of myself that was quite good looking, but when I got a flash of myself as I was and as others saw me, I nearly died. I was so disheartened that I walked out of the studio and disappeared for 3 or 4 days. If it hadn't been that I was in the middle of a picture and they wanted me to finish it, that would probably have been my last appearance on the screen. Anyway, they needed me for the finishing scenes, so they discovered my whereabouts and lured me back to the studio, saying that with a little making over they were sure I would turn out all right. I soon disposed of my small waistline and big pompadour and changed my entire scheme of dressing to more simple styles. I also found that light hair photographed better than dark, so I began to get the dye out of mine, which was quite a difficult task, and for quite a few weeks I carried around a head of hair that bore a Scotch plaid effect. I worked with Powers for about 6 months, intending all the time to go back on the stage when my voice got all right. The voice eventually did come back to its full strength, but I didn't go back on the stage. Instead, I used it to good advantage talking myself into a better job. I left Powers and went to the Lubin Company in Philadelphia for 3 times my former salary. At that time, Florence Lawrence and Arthur Johnson were the stars of the Lubin Company. In fact, I think they were about the first people to reach stardom in the entire picture business. I was to play secondary parts. I don't know just what it was, whether I was too good or too bad. Anyway, Miss Lawrence refused to work with me, so that they put me in other pictures in which I played leading parts. However, I didn't get on well there and only lasted about 2 months. I came back to New York, drifted over to the Pathé Frères in Jersey City, and asked to see the casting director. A tall, thin man walked out to interview me, and I recognized him as being Mr. Theodore Wharton, the same man who had given me the fatherly advice some months before at the Kalem studio. But this time he advised me in a different manner. "I think you are just the girl we need in this company," he said, and he led me into the office of the head of the firm, Mr. Louis Gasnier, who at that time spoke no English at all. I had to stand on exhibition before him and another Frenchman, who began criticizing me in their native tongue. Then, through an interpreter, they asked me to take off my hat, take down my hair, turn first profile, then front face, then go through a routine of different expressions with my face, while they discussed me in their own language, of which I understood nothing. I felt like one of the slaves being sold on the auction block in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Anyway, they must have decided for the best, and I started next day with Henry Walthall playing opposite me. I worked on for about 6 months with Mr. Gasnier as my director. At first it was pretty tough to act through translation, but finally I got used to that, and we got along so well that I was perfectly sorry to leave Pathé for a better offer. However, the Crystal Moving Picture Company came along and offered me so much more money that my Jewish instinct forced me to pack up my things and leave behind the emotional and dramatic parts that I had been playing in Jersey. I became chief pie slinger in the Crystal slapstick comedies. I don't know why, but all through my career I have had to change my line of parts in every company that I have worked for. Be that as it may, I was getting a very good salary, and also was being advertised enough so that I began to become known to the public. It was then that I began to receive letters from the fans asking for photographs, etc. It is really marvelous how many people who see pictures write letters to the players, And by the way, that is one of the greatest mediums through which we can judge our popularity. Actors in the theatre can only play at one place at a time. Therefore, they are seen by comparatively few people each night, while we of the cinema can be playing in thousands of places all over the world at the same time. Therefore, our audience is a million times larger. I don't suppose that during my entire stage career I ever received over a dozen letters of appreciation from admirers, and they were more or less of the mash note type. So the first letters I received through my picture work were indeed highly prized by me, and even today, although I don't have time to read them all, I should be heartbroken if they ceased, because the bundles of letters that are handed to me each day cheer me on a whole lot. It is really marvelous to get letters from all the different countries, and most of the ones I receive are just nice letters telling me that they like me, etc., and generally asking for a photograph or autograph to be sent to them in every corner of the globe, even from far-away places like Iceland, Siam, Finland, Guatemala, the colonies of South Africa, etc. I receive as many as 10,000 letters a month. This sounds almost unbelievable that so many people would take the time and even expense, for a great many send me presents too. However, it is true, and I suppose there are artists in the moving pictures who receive more than I. The money spent in sending photographs by us, if massed together, would make a large fortune. End of Part 7. Part 8 of Just Me by Pearl White. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Among the first letters that came to me was one from a United States sailor who had seen a picture of me shown in the Philippines. Now, I don't very often get love letters from male admirers, and this letter could hardly be classed as such. However, it ran in that direction, but was written in such a sweet way that it really touched me. This boy begged a photograph, saying that somehow there was something in my face that appealed to his better self, that maybe I reminded him of his mother or someone who had been very dear to him. Anyway, he wrote that he felt an affection for me that he had never had for another woman. I answered his letter, which was signed F. L. White, on board the battleship Huntington. It struck me as quite a coincidence, as my lost brother's name was Fred White, only his middle initial was E. He had also joined the Navy years before. Well, we kept up a correspondence for about a year, and I learned that my sailor admirer's name was also Fred. His letters were awfully nice and very romantic, and I really enjoyed reading them. Finally, he wrote that he was not going to bother me any more, as he realized that a poor sailor could never aspire to be anything in my life. I didn't hear from him again until 2 years ago. Then he wrote a nice friendly letter, among other things telling me that he once had a sister named Pearl, whom he had heard was married and lived out in Missouri, but as he had been estranged from his family for years, he didn't know much of her. Evidently he must have read some little squib in a magazine about me, for he was under the impression that I was born abroad. This letter sort of made me figure things out a bit, and I asked for the details of his origin, which he gave me, and I eventually found out that he was my own brother. Poor boy! That must have been an awful shock to him. His past childhood affection for me must have crept back unconsciously into his soul, and he had mistaken it for a different sentiment. He didn't communicate with me for some time after he was informed of our relationship. Then I received word that he was soon coming to New York and would look me up. That was in March 1917. In April I received word from one of the officers on board his ship that he had accidentally shot and killed himself while out on a scouting party near Sacramento, California. I wonder, was it an accident? It seems that tragedy has pursued my mother's children. My brother George, of whom I spoke in the early chapters of this book, was killed playing baseball when about 20. 2 other children were killed before my birth, one by drowning, and the other, who was only a small boy, blew his brains out with a shotgun.
My sister Grace is married and living quietly with her husband, one Loy Williams, and two little children. My father is still living, and perhaps he will see his whole family extinct. Who can tell? But to get back to my career. I worked on for some months doing comedy falls and what not until I was so tired that I needed a rest, for somehow I couldn't seem to take much interest in anything. One hot summer night I sat down to think and sum up my past. I decided that I owed myself some pleasure for my years of toil. Then I got out my bank book, which had been balanced that day, July 2nd, 1913, and I found that I had the large fortune of $6,000, more money than I had ever dreamed of possessing. So I decided that I was too rich to work for a while, and that I would go out and find myself a playground in which I could play. The next day I went to the studio and announced that I was putting on my makeup for the last time that summer. "Where are you going?" they asked. "Don't know," I answered, "but I've got too much money in the world, so I've got to go out and spend it." That afternoon a little idea began to creep into my mind, and I hustled about New York making a lot of arrangements. The next day was the 4th of July, and I was booked for a picnic at Coney Island. I was to leave at 8 o'clock in the morning with a girl that shared my flat, Jane Fernley. She was quite prominent in the moving pictures then. I bustled into her room and gave her an awful shock. Now, sleeping is a sport of which I am very fond, and poor Jane had always been the one to drag me out of bed, so naturally she was more than surprised at my early entrance into her room. "Is it time to go to Coney?" she sleepily asked. "I'm not going," I announced. "Why?" she questioned. "Because," I went on, "I'm sailing for Europe at 10 tomorrow morning, so I want to start packing now." Well, Jane nearly passed out of the picture with surprise, but when I showed her my ticket, marked July 5th, for a first-class cabin on the Olympic, she came to a little and began, "What are you going there for?" "I don't know," is all I could answer. "Do you know anybody in the whole of Europe?" she questioned. "Not a living soul," I truthfully answered, "but I have tucked away in my handbag 4 or 5 letters to people of so great a position in life that I don't expect they will have any desire to be annoyed by me. Anyway, I have decided to play. I have selected Europe as my playground, and if I don't find any playmates, I can at least stand by and watch the others." I walked up that gangplank in a holiday spirit, bound on a new adventure, and for the first time in my life I felt absolutely free from the cares of this world. I didn't have to worry where my next meals were coming from. I didn't care if my hair got all mussed up, my new dress got dirty, or my stockings full of runs. The whole world seemed full of smiles, and my face wore a perpetual grin. I must say that I felt very important too. All of the members of my company had come down to see me off, bringing me presents and flowers. There was a cameraman too, who was to take photographs of me for the moving picture magazines under the caption, "Pearl White leaving for Europe, where she expects to get new ideas for her forthcoming photoplays." And what a lot of ideas I collected, but not for moving pictures. The moving picture camera was there also to take my departure for the Universal Weekly. I don't suppose the people who saw the film in the theaters cared at all whether I went to Europe or not, but my own little group of companions looked upon me as the woman of the hour, and I certainly felt the part. Although I knew no one who was crossing on the same boat, I worried not. I was sailing to Europe on the wings of fate, and I didn't care which way I flew. A few months before, I had been working on the grounds of the New York University, and one young student, he was about 17, had helped me to get different groups of boys to work in some of the scenes. I guess I was the first actress that this youth had ever known, and, as he was himself harboring an ambition to become an actor, in his eyes I immediately became an object of admiration and adoration. Each afternoon thereafter found him in my studio watching me act. He was an awfully nice stage-struck boy,
who belonged to one of New York's most aristocratic families. Thus he comes into the plot. He was on hand early in the morning to drive me down to the boat in his father's car. He managed to stand next to me in the photographs and lingered on the gangplank until the last moment, feeling very much in the limelight and very important to himself. And there, amid tears, handshakes, goodbyes, and be sure and rights, into the scene walked two other young men who turned out to be a couple of old college chums. There was only a moment for a hasty introduction to the newcomers, who were to be passengers on the same boat with me. But as my young escort was being hustled ashore by a husky deckhand, he managed to impart the great news that I was the most wonderful, interesting, and entertaining girl in the world, and implored his old school pals to look after me on the way over. There exits my youthful admirer. So I dashed to stern of the boat to wave farewell to the camera on shore. With me dashed my two new companions, my first playmates in my new game of life. These two lads spent the first few days introducing me to their many relatives and friends on board, always slipping along the password that I was a very brilliant person. How easy it is to become popular on board ship when there is a bit of mystery attached to yourself, and you are advertised as being brilliant and entertaining. That was me. The passenger list was composed of some very smart people, and I was so thrilled and flattered by the attention they bestowed upon me that I didn't know whether I was on foot or horseback half the time. Me, poor little Pearl White, who had always labored from early morning until late at night, hobnobbing with the idle rich, that is comic enough. Ah, but the biggest laugh is yet to come. During the first few days the glamour of my new venture had kept my heart hitting on high, and I didn't have much time to think. But when my pulse did strike normal, I sort of calmed down to the grim realization that I was not contented and I didn't know just what was the matter. I do now. Romance? During my whole life, up until then, I had been so busy getting myself food, clothing, and shelter that I hadn't had time to get myself in love. But now, with relaxation, came a lot of sentiment, and mighty mushy sentiment at that. Sitting out on a deck chair at peace with the world, well, if you have ever fallen in love with a person whom you have only seen once, you know what silly thoughts chase each other through your mind. I had fallen. And as I looked into space, a vision of two very blue eyes and a wonderful smile kept rising before me. Over and over I fancied myself again in Sherry's meeting him on that hot afternoon on the 3rd of July. Anyhow, I got so doggone lovesick that I didn't get seasick, so that helped some. To unravel the thread of my young love's dream, when on this said 3rd of July I had decided on my hasty flight, I conceived the brilliant idea of calling up a friend, who was handling foreign films in America, and asking him for a letter of introduction to some of the moving picture studios in England, France, and Italy. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when I made this request, and the answer came back over the phone. Yes, certainly, he would gladly do so, but that he was leaving his office shortly to give a tea party at Sherry's, and if I would join them there at 5, he would have the promised letters, all signed and sealed, waiting for me. I was there on the minute of 5. I had never been in Sherry's before, but I marched boldly in and joined the party. He was one of the party. I didn't hear his name when we were introduced, for he looked straight into my eyes and smiled. Heavens, what a smile he gave me! I guess it was the same one he bestowed upon all women. However, I didn't know this, and I immediately became all hands and feet, and felt foolish in general. Anyway, I managed to slip him my hand in acknowledgment of said introduction. Then it seems that in doing so, I shifted one of my feet and planted it firmly upon a pet corn belonging to a lady standing next to me, and she, being a lady, screamed like a wounded eagle, while he, being a gentleman, leaped to her side, begging a million pardons, as though it was his foot that had done the damage, while I, being just an ordinary dunce, let him take the credit and just stood in mute admiration. This little act ruined my success with the ladies in the party, but I didn't care because he sat next to me at the table. I don't think I ever tried so hard in my life to be amusing. Of course, I was an awful failure. However, he, who by the way everyone called simply "Bep," was a wonderful audience and laughed at my unfunny remarks. The tea was about over, so I collected my letters and mine host proposed a toast to my trip abroad. "Oh, are you going to my country?" inquired Bep. Now I didn't know just what country was his, but he had a foreign accent, so I took a chance and said, "Oh, certainly." Anyway, I was willing to go wherever it might be. "Oh, that's fine," said he. "Don't you want me to give you a letter to the nicest man I know?" Of course I did. So out to the writing room we went, and he wrote not one letter but three. The first was addressed to Rome. Ah, thought I, he must be an Italian and know a lot of nice men. Then he had a fourth inspiration and wrote one to London. "Bobby is an awfully silly fellow," he announced, "but I am sure he will amuse you." Of course I was sure too. Besides, I was perfectly content to just sit there and look at him, and the more he wrote, the longer I could look. Silly, isn't it? He accompanied me out to the taxi, wished me bon voyage, and told me to be sure and write and tell him how I liked his friends. There, I guess, the incident ended for him, but not for me. Those letters, I looked at them dozens of times on the boat. They were all addressed to Baron, Duke, or Count, etc. There wasn't a Mister in the whole bunch, and worse luck, they were all written in French and signed merely "Bep," meaning nothing to me. Now I had read of dukes, counts, etc., but never imagined that they were so plentiful, and I couldn't quite believe that one man could know so many. I was afraid some joke was being played upon me. Nevertheless, I was going to present at least one of them, so that I could write to Bep. If it were true and I could meet so many people with titles, well, that sounded very grand to me. I think it was trying to get a little snobbish in my thoughts of the future. Speaking of titles, there was a young fellow on board who had been very attentive to me, but for some reason or other I did not like him much. I thought his name was just Smith, until one day he sent a book to my cabin with his card, which read Mr. Lord Haskin Smith. What a thrill that handed me! A Lord! Mr. Lord, at that. None of my treasured letters were addressed Mr. Baron, Mr. Duke, etc. So I just naturally concluded that Mr. Lord was someone just that much more important. Well, I brightened up after that, and whenever I met Smith, I was all smiles and attention. I noticed he used to look rather funny at my "How do you do, Lord Haskin Smith?" But I thought he was just sort of a strange young man, and I was proud to know him. One other on board who plays an important part in this yarn was a colonel, a man who for years had been spoken of as the handsomest man in London. So with this reputation to his credit, he had won the hearts of scores of women. But the colonel was now getting old and rather bored with the fair sex. However, somehow he rather took sort of a fatherly fancy to me, and we became good pals during those 7 days on the ocean. So he promised to arrange a lot of parties for me when he got to London. I didn't know much of London, but I had been told that the Carlton was the smartest hotel there, and as I had decided to be smart, to the Carlton I took myself. The London season was at its height. Of course the hotels were crowded and rooms had to be reserved days in advance. I didn't know this and walked calmly in and wrote my name on the register. Then I received the sad news that there were no rooms to be had. I was in great grief because I had told Bep that that was going to be my address, and I was simple enough to imagine that he might write me a letter. I guess my face must have shown my disappointment, because an old gentleman, whom I had also met on the boat, offered to give me his room, saying that he could bunk with some friends. Thus fate looked after me once again. End of part 8. Part 9 of Just Me by Pearl White. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Now somehow I always feel more courageous when I'm all dressed up in new clothes. So the first move I made was to get myself a new outfit. I went to the best shop in town, where the saleslady, among other things, told me that I looked best in white or black. So I decided to take her tip, and black and white it was straight through. I had to wait several days for the first gown, so I spent these becoming a model tourist and seeing the sights. My first scenery was to be delivered at 3 that afternoon, and I decided I would just stay in bed until then. But at 10 the phone rang, my first call. I had sent out my letter of introduction to the Count the night before, and it was he. He asked me to tea that afternoon, saying that he would love to hear news of Bep. Talk of Bep! What could be sweeter? Well, my small room and bath were not big enough to hold me after that conversation, so I decided to get out and get some air. I donned one of my American sport suits and set out for a hike to calm down my surging emotions. I was just crossing Pall Mall, bound for Hyde Park, when I was nearly knocked down by a gray racing car containing 2 young men. I dodged it by an inch and landed in front of a tram. Then I took a step backward and would have encountered another car, only I took a flying leap and caught onto the back of the gray racer, a la Serial, and landed on the tire rack. "Oh, Miss White!" exclaimed one of the men in the racer. Then I looked down into the smiling face of Lord Haskin Smith. They started to drive me to the park. However, before we got there, we all decided that we should celebrate the event by having lunch together. They were going to Sunningdale afterward to play golf, and suggested that I join in a game of golf. I said I would love to. Besides, I was all dressed for the part. Of course, I didn't know how to play, but I didn't tell them that. The chance to spend the afternoon with this man, whom I took to be an English lord, was not to be sneezed at, so I decided that I wouldn't show up for my appointment with the Count, but would stick with him. Golf! I had never even held a club in my hand, but I knew not the danger of my deception. Well, the lord loaned me a set of clubs, which I immediately said were much too long for me. I didn't know the difference, but I had to start finding fault in case I went all wrong at the game. "What grip do you use?" he asked as he teed up my ball. "Grip? Grip? Oh, yes, I have one of my own." I lied. And as he stepped aside to let me drive, I continued, "Oh, do shoot first, Lord Haskin Smith. I get so nervous when anybody watches me." Nervous! I wanted to see how the trick was done. Now all of you regular golf players know the treachery of this game. So many people play better their first attempt than they do for years afterwards. Perhaps it is because they don't know the horrors of the game, get all nervous and think themselves out of a lot of shots. So with all the confidence in the world, I walked bravely up and gave that ball such a clean smack that it went sailing through the air, farther than I have ever driven since, and I have been playing now for nearly 3 years straight. "My, what a wonderful drive!" exclaimed the lord. "If you continue like that, I can't give you a stroke a hole." I didn't know what that meant either, but the thing that worried me was when to use the different clubs in the bag. There were 8 in all. Therefore I sneaked my caddy a couple of shillings and told him to hand me the right club at the right time. Thus I played on famously for 6 holes. On the 7th I drove a rotten ball. "Do you live in London, Lord Haskin Smith?" I inquired as we walked toward the fairway. "No," he replied, "I live in Washington." "Washington? Is that a nice place?" I went on. "Well, it's nice enough to be the capital of the United States. Aren't you kidding me?" he laughed. "Oh, then you are an American," I continued, taking a brassey straight into a bunker. The truth dawned upon me. Mr. Lord. Lord was his given name. Haskin was his middle name. He was just Mr. Smith after all, and I had thought I was out with a nobleman. I could have kicked myself all over that golf course, but instead I got all fussed up. took about 10 to get out of the bunker, realized what a serious game golf is, and was all for getting back to London to meet the Count, whom I hoped would turn out to be a real one. So I told Smith I was getting very tired, and he drove me back to London. I never told him of my stupidity concerning my thoughts of him, but I wish I had, because he was really an awfully nice fellow with a sense of humor. I hustled into my new gown, which was waiting for me at the hotel. It was a white chiffon affair with a large fluffy hat to match, and the crowning glory of the outfit was a huge white fox fur. That summer was about the first one that women began to wear furs in the hot weather. My fur was expensive and hot, but I had to be in style, so I suffered along with the others, draped it around my neck, and much pleased with my whole appearance, dashed down to meet the Count, who was waiting for me in the lobby. The Count. He was a real one too, all done up in a high hat, cutaway coat, white spats, and sported a monocle. He was silly both in looks and actions. He kissed my hand with all the ecstasy of his Latin nature, and made me feel from the first moment that I had made an awful hit with him. And when we walked into the tea room and the head waiter rushed up all smiles and inquired just which table Monsieur le Count preferred, I felt pretty stuck up and aristocratic. Well, I couldn't pronounce the Count's name. We decided that I would call him Bobby. His Christian name was Roberta, so Bobby it was from then on. We rambled on that afternoon talking of Bep as though he was my bosom friend, and I was ashamed to admit that I didn't even know Bep's real name. Besides, I was getting a little more snobbish, and decided it must be nothing less than a Count from then on. And I was sure that Bep didn't have a title, or he would have signed himself as such. Well, Bobby was all over the place from then on, sending me flowers and dancing attendance upon me. He also sent me a beautiful Russian wolfhound, who was as dumb as any dog was ever allowed to be. Nevertheless, I thought this large white animal made rather a striking picture against my white frocks, so I led him about London, feeling that I looked rather elegant. I also learned that to be really swell I should have a chaperone and a maid. Therefore I elected an invalid aunt, who, however, was always too ill to go out with me, and a very polite maid. In other words, I answered the phone in 3 different voices, which served my purpose without any expense. I would probably have had more servants, only I couldn't change my voice any more times. I didn't say much, but showed visible signs that I was a young American heiress, and as such I was looked upon. I was just a fine young fakir trying to sneak into society. Now I had promised the Colonel, whom I spoke of before, that as soon as I got located I would phone him my whereabouts. I had delayed doing this until I got my new clothes. The dog came into my life the morning after my tea with Bobby, and that furnished a wonderful excuse to call up the Colonel. "Oh, I have such a wonderful new dog," I gushed over the phone, and of course he answered as I expected. "Oh, I would love to see it." So I, knowing very little of social etiquette, I asked if the dog and I might visit him. "Oh, that would be jolly," he answered. "Do come. I will send my car for you this minute." So to the Colonel's house went the dog and myself. Now I can't vouch for the dog, but for myself I can say that that was the first luxuriant, well-appointed home that I had ever stepped into. And I scented bad news ahead the moment I entered the drawing room and was presented to 4 other strange, serious-looking men besides the Colonel. It seems that a meeting of high finance was going on, and that lunch was to be served shortly. The dog was given the once-over and then led out in state by a butler, while I was given the information that I must stay to lunch. I don't know whether they suspected that I might be good for a laugh, or whether one customer had disappointed. Anyway, I stayed and noted that the table was set for 6. I was placed at the head of the table, with an extra butler standing behind my chair, which got me nervous right away. That table! Jerusalem! It looked like a Christmas tree. There were at least a dozen different knives and forks laid beside my plate, so my only hope to draw the right one at the right time was to follow someone else, but this was not to be. I, being the only lady, was served first. That was my downfall. The parade started. One butler entered with a huge silver platter, slipped it to the other one, who in turn placed it before me. Now I didn't know just what this concoction was, but I strongly suspected it of being fish. However, just which was the fish and which were the trimmings I knew not, consequently there was nothing to do but to say "No, thank you," and leave it to the next guest to dissect. "Oh," said the Colonel, "you should try some of this lovely salmon." And by the same token, salmon is my favorite dish. But I listened not to the pleading of my stomach and stuck to my "No, thank you." The next course was soup. Nice red tomato soup, all dished out, so I took a chance that I would get the right spoon and get away with that. But here was another catch. I didn't have a napkin. There was one in front of my plate, all draped around a piece of bread, which gave it the appearance of a full-blown rose. I looked around the table and discovered that those in front of the other plates had disappeared. Therefore, I figured they were put there to be used, but whether to boldly unravel the said napkin or sneak it, I wasn't quite sure. However, the others had taken theirs while I wasn't looking, so I decided to get mine the same way, and to get it at once because I felt that I needed some protection for my new white gown against that red soup. Therefore, I started to tell a story, gesticulating wildly with my right hand and sneaking the napkin with my left. The story was going well, and I had succeeded in unwinding said napkin unobserved, but as I drew it toward me with a wide sweep, I upset my neighbor's soup plate, spattering the contents all over his white waistcoat. Well, the game was all over. So I arose, chucked my cards on the table, and confessed that I was cheating. "Gentlemen," I said, "I am sorry, so very sorry that I stayed here to wreck your luncheon. To be truthful, I am all wrong. I am absolutely bewildered by the whole surroundings. I don't know just what all this collection of knives and forks means. Your gang of servants make me nervous. I don't know when to eat, what to eat, or how to eat it. In other words, I'm sunk, and there is no use trying to bluff it out." So saying, I placed my right hand on the table to sort of steady myself, and flop it went into my soup. How I wished I could faint, or die, or do something to pass out of the picture at that moment. But I couldn't. I was too doggone healthy. I think maybe I would have burst into tears, but everybody began to laugh, so I joined in. "By Jove," said the gentleman whose waistcoat I had ruined, "what a confession for a woman to make! I simply love your frankness." And there, through being honest and admitting my ignorance, I gained some applause from one of the greatest men in history. Lord Kitchener. Yes, a real lord this time, and the most brilliant and wonderful human being that I have ever met. The laugh was on me, but they wouldn't let me go home, so I remained through the rest of the luncheon. The Colonel was served first. I followed his lead and got through all right. I decided I would become absolutely honest, and told them stories of my poverty-stricken past. They were amused. I hope you will also be. So the party turned out a success after all. I have the memory of spending an afternoon with 5 of the biggest men of our time. Well, they have probably used me as the heroine of a lot of funny stories, for I met them a good many times afterward, and the Colonel did a whole lot toward giving me a social education. He secured a chaperone for me, who steered me through a lot of very wonderful social functions, where I learned a lot, and we all had plenty of laughs at the comic things I did. As far as the Count and his crowd were concerned, I still went on as a gay deceiver and got away with it. He waltzed me all about London, proposing marriage every day or so, thinking I was a young American heiress. The glamour of becoming a countess was very alluring, and I think I would have married him at once if it hadn't been for Bep. He, who I didn't even know, and although I did not admit it to myself, I was madly in love with. Silly, but then. Well, 2 months of this wonderful life went by. My money was dwindling away, and I wanted to see Paris and Rome. So as usual I acted on impulse, packed my bag, told no one of my intended departure, caught the 2 o'clock train from Charing Cross via Folkestone, Bologna, to Paris. Under ordinary circumstances I should have reached Paris early that night, where I had rooms engaged at the Ritz. Yes, I had rooms now. Like most people, I got sick enough crossing the Channel, and, as I walked through the customs officers at Bologna, feeling none too jolly, one dark-looking Frenchman with a big moustache opened up my bag, then gave a violent shriek. I was about the last one to leave the boat. Consequently, any help I might have obtained in this situation had already boarded the Paris express. Said officer burst into reams of French, but I didn't know what was the matter and felt in no mood to be bothered, so I reached for my bag. And I don't know whether I did it on purpose or not. Anyway, my elbow landed square in his eye. More shrieks. And he pulled my trusty revolver out of my handbag. I thought maybe I had to deal with a madman, so I made a dash for the train, but he was quickly joined by 2 gendarmes, who withheld me by force. Now it seems that to cross the border line into France with firearms in one's possession is a horrible offense. And to make it worse, I had a dagger and a couple of decks of playing cards, 2 other violations of the French law. I didn't know this, and I didn't understand his volley of French. So up to the Tribunal of Justice they forcibly dragged me, and by the time they'd got me before the chief with a translator, my train had departed for Paris. End of Part 9. Part 10 of Just Me by Pearl White. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. When I found out what all the row was about, I pleaded much innocence and sorrow, so they must have decided to forgive me, took my weapons and allowed me to depart. This might have been mighty nice of them, but my train had gone in the meantime, and I had to wait hours for the next one, so I wasn't so full of gratitude, and I didn't reach Paris until 4 o'clock in the morning. I had met on the train an old lady who spoke English, a nice old soul, and as she was going to the Grand Hotel, I decided I'd go there too. The Grand Hotel in Paris! I think it had the largest rooms in the world, so by the time I had made a complete tour of mine, it was daybreak, and out into the streets I went to see Paris at dawn. Sounds romantic, but it wasn't. I wandered around for a while, and then, being hungry, went into a restaurant for some food. I noticed there was a large mounted horse's head nailed over the door, and I thought at the time it was a very queer decoration. I couldn't tell much what the bill of fare was about, but knowing that filet mignon meant steak, I ordered that along with coffee and pommes de terre. I knew those too. I also found out the day after what that horse's head meant in front of the door. I was eating horse meat. Anyway, it tasted all right, so why not? I went to the Ritz that evening and claimed my rooms, but I had scarcely entered them when the telephone rang. It was Bobby, the Count, on the other end of the wire. It seems he had learned my destination from a hotel porter in London. He told me he was in Paris on business. I knew he was lying, but it pleased me to think he had followed me there, so for the moment I rather liked him for it. I stayed on in Paris for a few weeks and saw a lot of my acquaintances from London, but most of my time was spent with Bobby. During this time I got down to a lot of serious thinking, decided to forget the Bep idea and marry Bobby. I didn't love him, but then this marriage would make a wonderful hit with my friends in America, so I decided to take the big chance. To Bobby I was supposed to be under 18, therefore I had to cable for my parents' consent. What a laugh it would have handed my father if I had. Anyway, in the meantime I wanted to go to Italy alone, so the Count wired his sister to meet me in Genoa and take me to Milan, where we were to be married. I boarded the Rome express, got cold feet at Genoa, didn't get off the train, but went straight on through to Rome. I stopped at the Excelsior Hotel in rooms overlooking the Queen's mother's house, found a couple of artists out at the Cines moving picture studio who could speak English, hung around watching them work for a couple of days, feeling rather proud of my escapade, when in marches Bobby. He was pretty cross with me, so the conversation that first evening was not very pleasant. It was out of season in Rome and there wasn't much to do, so he decided to take me to the cinema. "These moving pictures are very amusing at times," he said. Yes, thought I, in more ways than one. So we went to this stuffy little theater, feeling none too kindly toward one another. The lights went out and the picture started. In a couple of seconds out I dashed, acting all over the screen. Bobby looked at the picture and then at me. I saw him out of the corner of my eye and just stared straight ahead. Said picture was an old-time pâté and about the rottenest one I had ever done. I was dumped down a coal hole, knocked about and all messed up in general. I suggested that we get out before the lights went on again, and out we went before the picture was finished. Then, in answer to his inquiring gaze, I said, "Yes, that was me. I work for a living. Now you know why I don't want to marry you." Of course he said, "Nonsense," that he loved me just the same and all that sort of thing, but I noticed that his monocle slipped out of his eye, a thing that always happened when he was disappointed. So I let him rave on, knowing that in Italy an actress is not a cheerfully greeted daughter-in-law in the best families. I had just enough money left to spend about a week someplace and buy my ticket to America, so I decided that I would go to Naples, take a look at Vesuvius, then home via the Mediterranean. Bobby, the Count, went also. He took me to stop in his aunt's villa just outside of Naples, and what a success I was there! The whole outfit, outside of Bobby, couldn't speak English, and my Italian being very weak, I don't know whether he told them I was his fiancée, daughter, or what not. Anyway, I was certainly a stranger in the house. However, now that I was sure I wasn't going to have Bobby around me for the rest of my days, I liked him a whole lot, and we had a lot of fun together in Naples. We went to a little jewelry shop one day and had half of his watch chain riveted on his left wrist, the other half on my right ankle, swearing undying devotion, and that we each, at any rate, would never marry anyone else. He is in the army now, and I suppose that his is replaced by a chain with a nameplate on it, while I have grown used to mine, so it is still on my ankle. I only stayed in Naples about 5 days, and then I met some American friends who were going to Monte Carlo, and as I had an invitation to spend some time with a family in Nice, I decided I would take advantage of that and also stop off a day at Monte Carlo en route. I bid farewell to Bobby, went to Monte Carlo, where again fate stepped in and changed my whole career. I went into the casino in the afternoon, but not having much money left, I only bought $50 worth of coins and placed them all on the red. I had never seen a wheel before and I didn't know the percentage of the game, so I played only red straight through $50, 250 francs a shot. And I am glad I did, because red turned up 11 times straight running, a thing that seldom happens. There was a rather fat gentleman with a huge black mustache and a long beard sitting next to me. He had been plunging heavily on numbers, but none of them would show. I had seen this same man around the Ritz when I was in Paris a good many times, but I didn't know who he was. In fact, I don't know yet. However, it was he who was responsible for a good portion of my stay in Europe. The afternoon of which I speak he had been watching me very intently, and it sort of made me nervous, so I cashed in my chips intending to move on to another table. I guess I must have given him a hunch, because he placed a bunch of gold in my hand and said, "Pardon me, mademoiselle, but will you please play these for me? It might bring me luck, and I have been losing all afternoon." Well, that was fair enough. Besides, I had been told that the only system on which you can win is to play other people's money. By the way, that is a good system, as you can't lose at least. Anyway, I banked on number 7 and it showed. This man, who I think was a Frenchman, was all excited and insisted that I keep on playing for him, so I stuck until evening and played in the most phenomenal luck that I have ever seen. I don't think we exchanged a dozen words the whole afternoon. and I, not knowing the etiquette of gambling, didn't think I was entitled to any of the spoils. But when he cashed in and found himself $18,000 to the good, he insisted that I take half of it. $9,000, more money than I have ever seen before. Anyway, I stuffed it in my pocket, shook hands with the old man, who said he hoped to see me in Paris, galloped back to the hotel with my huge roll of money, and told my American friends the great news. They kidded me a lot and told me I had better be careful, or I would have this same dark bearded man on my trail for life. This didn't sound so good, but I had so much money that I decided to skip Nice and set out for Paris to buy me a lot of new clothes, as my wardrobe was getting rather shabby. I got back to Paris, ordered myself a lot of French creations, but before they were delivered, I can never tell you why, I, for some strange reason, took only a couple of bags and went to Belgium. That was just about the most foolish thing that I have ever done in my life, because I went straight to Brussels, engaged a room at the Palace Hotel, where I spent 8 days in the confinement of those 4 walls, writing a play. I don't know, but I guess I wasn't used to loafing, so I sort of used that medium as an outlet for my pent-up emotions. And, as I used Bep as the hero of this sloppy melodrama, I guess I did relieve myself of a lot of sentiment on paper. Then, after my 8 days of labor, when I reread my effort, I decided the play was pretty rotten, tore it up, and having seen nothing at all of Brussels, went to Germany. I arrived in Berlin, where I met a family that I knew, and more or less played around with them for 5 or 6 days, hating the place. Then I bought a ticket to Hamburg, intending to take a Hamburg American liner home, but when I got to the station, I had another change of heart, tore up my ticket, threw it to the 4 winds, and purchased another bound for Paris. Paris was calling me. Somehow that city sort of gets in one's blood and makes you always want to go back to it. Back in Paris, I collected my new outfit, started to learn French, and went to an art school where I began taking lessons in art, thinking I was going to make an artist of myself. The Colonel was living in Paris then, and of course knew reams of French people, so I began chasing around to parties and theaters, seeing Paris in general, and paying no attention at all to my art studies. Anyway, it didn't matter much because I was pretty stupid, and besides, I guess artists are born, not made. I had told the Colonel and others of my affair in the gambling house at Monte Carlo, and from my description of the dark bearded man, they had concluded that he was quite a notorious gambler operating in France at that time. I was always on the alert, watching for said supposed gambler around the Ritz, with more or less a little fear in my young heart. I was coming in the Place Vendôme entrance one morning when I bumped smack into this man, who, to my great surprise, begged a million pardons and passed on. I saw him several times after that about the hotel, but he merely passed me by without the slightest sign of recognition. I guess the little incident at the wheel had happened hundreds of times in his life and were quickly forgotten. The joke was on me. This dark man whom I had planned to elude didn't even remember that I was on earth, and I don't mind telling you that it took a couple of kinks out of my vanity and made me just a little bit sore. I had been doing the society stuff around Gay Paris, and I guess I was getting a little bit bored and craved excitement, and I got some one night. I had tucked away in my bag still another letter of which I have not spoken before, so I took that out and mailed it to an address in Montmartre. Before leaving for Europe I had spoken to one of the employees in the laboratory of the studio where I worked. He was a regular Apache type, lately arrived from France, so I suspected that he might know some thrilling people there. He was delighted to give me a letter of introduction to his sister. This was the letter. I was all dressed up in one of my best productions several evenings later, and had an engagement to go to the opera. About 7 o'clock the phone rang, and the clerk at the desk told me that there were 4 rather weird-looking people downstairs asking for me. Said clerk was an Englishman, and imparted the news that they were pretty tough-looking customers, and that he didn't think that I ought to see them. but I suspected that they were the answer to my letter and that there might be some fun ahead. So I told them to wait, and dressed like a Christmas tree as I was, I went down to meet them. I had divined the truth. No one in the bunch was able to write English, and they had answered my letter in person. The husband of the woman to whom my letter was addressed spoke some English. One other spoke Italian, so I decided that I would get along all right with them. Therefore, I cut my date for the opera, and we all went out together. As usual, being an American, they took me to the Folies Bergère, where I ran into several friends who looked much askance at me, but I was out for a lark and thought I was having a lot of fun. After the theater they would have taken me to the Dead Rat or some place like that where Americans always go. But no, I wanted to see the real Montmartre, not the show places. I therefore asked them to take me to some little place that they would go to themselves to have a few dances and a quiet evening. Quiet! Gee whiz! There was a hurried discussion in French between the four. Then we all got into a hack and drove through a lot of winding streets. I tried to find the place afterwards, but never could. Then they led me into a cellar, where immediately I became the center of attraction, naturally, as I was all done up in expensive evening clothes. Well, I saw Montmartre. That is, for a couple of minutes. There was a wild-eyed looking bunch of people sitting around little tables, drinking some kind of strange liquor out of tall green bottles. Now the people that I was with were respectively two married couples, so I was sort of a fifth wheel for the dancing part of the program, and they introduced me to a couple of gay Othellos with whom I could dance. One in particular was a dashing young Apache all done up in a cap, a flowing tie and a velvet coat. I took a couple of sips of the strange liquor, which started my head spinning like a top. The music started, he grabbed me, and we started out on a wild Apache dance, something new to me. Anyway, I stuck, and he slammed me around all over that room. I wasn't on my feet hardly any of the time, but being rather acrobatic, I got along all right, and my partner was delighted with me. And when he led me back to the table, he took out a couple of franc notes, which he pinned on my left shoulder. I didn't know the meaning of this, but I now suspect it meant that I belonged to him as a partner for the rest of the dancing. Besides, I didn't understand any of his monologues in French, so I thought I was having a good time and didn't protest. The music started up again, and again I was grabbed, but this time by another man who was sitting at another table. He was a little more genteel and spoke English rather well. Being a blonde, I think he must have been a Swiss or something of that sort. Well, he wasn't so rough, and we danced around almost normally, but every time we passed Mr. Apache, number 1, he scowled dreadfully and flung a lot of violent French phrases at us, which I didn't understand, and on I danced. Finally, my partner coached me in a French sentence, which in turn I delivered to the angry Apache. I guess that sentence must have been all wrong. Anyway, the next thing I remember is of seeing a lot of stars. And when I came to, I was being carried into the Ritz Hotel by the night watchman, covered with blood. End of Part 10. Part 11 of Just Me by Pearl White. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I don't know just what happened, but I guess that the aforesaid Apache, in a fit of passion, had draped one of the tall green bottles over my head, and my companions had put me into a cab, then deposited me on the front doorstep of the hotel, being afraid to take me inside. Well, I got a lot of stitches taken in my head, which was cut open quite badly, a lot of "I told you so's" from the English clerk, and a lot of laughs from my friends. Needless to say, I was through seeing Montmartre, although I did one evening put on an old suit of clothes, but along with a couple of regular friends this time, went into the downstairs part of the Bal Tabarin, where I spent hours giving a few francs to all of the English-speaking coquettes, and got them to tell me the story of their downfall. Maybe a lot they told me wasn't true, be that as it may. I collected a lot of pathos and an insight into some strange forms of humanity. I love to study the different phases of human nature. Perhaps when I get old, the applause ceases, and I see others taking my place in the limelight, this will be my savior, because I realize the tragedy that awaits each one of us who follows a professional career. To grow old without children, through whom we can live our lives again, makes me shudder. But what is to be, must be, I guess, and anyway the palmists read my lifeline as "sudden death at 40." And why not? Up to date I can truthfully say that my soul is pretty clean, and I have never done a great wrong to anyone on earth. All those who know me must admit that I am square. The only thing that I am thoroughly ashamed of concerning my life is that I didn't get over and help to do something toward winning the big fight. I absolutely was unfit for a nurse. I did try mighty hard to go over as an ambulance driver, but they wouldn't take me. I could have gone over as an entertainer, not that I would have been entertaining, but it is just the idea of doing something. However, when the Americans were allowed to go in that capacity, I was in the midst of an unfinished picture, and the armistice was signed in the meantime. I have worked very hard for the Liberty Loan and Red Cross drives, but that doesn't clear my conscience one bit, for after all, if I had had the right spirit I would have gotten over there somehow, and a million good excuses don't help me at all. But the idea of this story is not to throw bouquets or mud at myself, but to turn loose the dark horse in my closet of life. So getting on to the last of my stay abroad. I attended quite a large reception in London one night, exactly 7 months from the date on which I had left America. Then I boarded a steamer at Southampton the next morning, bound for America, with a lot of memories of some wonderful times. I had a morning paper under my arm, and when I opened it up, on the front page was a rising young cinema star of America who was visiting London to get ideas for her forthcoming photoplays. I don't know whether I had been recognized by some energetic young reporter or not. However, I strongly suspect Mr. Herbert Brennan, one of our greatest moving picture directors, as being the guilty party. He was taking pictures abroad at that time, and I had run across him some months before in Paris. Anyway, the deed was done in a spirit of kindness. A photograph had been dug up in the office of one of the London moving picture magazines, who in turn passed it over to the newspaper. Maybe this article surprised some of my society friends, who looked upon me as a debutante and did not suspect me of being an actress. Maybe not. Anyway, that was the beginning of my name in the papers. Well, the tall buildings of New York looked mighty good to me coming up the harbor, and I just felt like jumping up and down and shouting with joy at getting back to America. Besides, Bep might be there, and I had not forgotten my sentiment regarding him. Again, Mr. Fate. I had been back about 2 days when, coming out of the Ritz one day in a great hurry, I bumped into Bep and nearly knocked him over. It seems I just turned out to be clumsy whenever he was around. "Oh, Miss White," he exclaimed, "when did you get back to America? Why didn't you write to me and tell me how you were getting on abroad?" Well, I couldn't tell him that a letter addressed to one Bep, New York City, wouldn't have meant much to the post office authorities, so I lied that I was so busy or some such rot. "Do have dinner with me this evening to celebrate the occasion," he begged, and of course I said that I would love to, which was the truth. We were to dine at Sherry's at 7 o'clock. I started to dress about 4 in the afternoon, hoping to look my grandest. As a rule, it takes me about 20 minutes to get ready for anything, but not this occasion. I called in a masseur and a hairdresser and told them to do their darndest, and they did. I was massaged and marcelled all over the place. I tried on every Paris creation that I owned, and they all looked rotten to me then, those same gowns that had looked so gorgeous when I bought them. Finally I got myself fastened into a plain white satin one, and with no other decoration whatever, except my brightest smile, I went to Sherry's with Bep, feeling awkward and actually shy. I ate my dinner in sort of a trance, just adoring Bep, and allow me to say he certainly had a collection of the most charming conversation that I have ever listened to. "Why didn't you even send me a postcard?" he asked, as the waiter was serving the coffee. I decided to try the truth. "Well, to be frank," I answered, "I didn't know your name, and as all of your friends always referred to you as just simply Bep, I was ashamed to ask what your real name might be." "Oh, then you are entirely forgiven," he laughed. "And to make sure that that will never happen again, here is my card. You see, Bep is just a nickname that all my friends use." I took the neatly engraved card and read the longest title thereon that I had ever seen printed. "Oh," I stammered unconsciously, "then you are of the nobility too, and I thought you were just a man." "Well," said he, "I have a title, but I am a man just the same." "Of course," I feebly replied. "Don't mind me. I'm awfully silly." Then I gulped down a mouthful of red hot coffee that nearly cooked me. I guess I must have looked a little bit shaky. He took out his cigarette case. "Do you smoke?" he inquired, passing it to me. I didn't, but decided to. I noticed a couple of photographs of two small boys pasted on the inside of the cover, so I wanted to get a good look at them. "What pretty children," I casually remarked. "Are they yours?" "You bet they are," he answered. "And the two finest boys in the world." Then he offered me a light. I puffed on my cigarette and darned near choked as he continued. "They are over in Europe now with their mother, and I hope to see them very soon." I secretly threw away my cigarette and apologized for my coughing, saying that I had a terrible cold. "That's too bad," he sympathized. Then, "By the way, Miss White, the next time you come to Europe you must visit us. We have a nice little villa on the Riviera, and I'm sure that you and my wife will like each other." His wife! I pulled myself together and said that I would love to. Then I tackled a glass of ice water with success, and as I drank a small voice seemed to whisper in my ear, "It's back to the movies for you, Pearl White. Your romances only end happily on the screen." So Bep sailed for Europe, and back I went. The idea of serial pictures had just been born over in Jersey, and Pathe offered me the chance to risk my life through a series of episodes called "The Perils of Pauline." So I dashed over to the studio intending to take the job. I was met by my old director, Mr. Gasnier, who was still residing at the head of the firm, and he laid bare the situation. I don't mind telling you that I nearly walked out of the studio without signing the contract that they had prepared. To be sure, they offered me a lot of money and so much advertising that I couldn't escape gaining at least some fame. However, the odds seemed against me. "Hello, girl, how do you like my Paris?" were the words that greeted me from my old boss. "Wonderful," said I, "but what about the job you are tempting me with?" "Well, do you want to become famous?" he asked. "Certainly," I replied. "That's been my lifelong struggle." "Then sign here," he continued, handing me a couple of typewritten pages and casually asking if I carried any life insurance. Now I have never signed a legal document before, but that speech about life insurance made me hesitate and read the pages before me. The farther into the contract I got, the worse things looked for me, and when I got to the clause, "The party of the second part, being of age, takes her part in this motion picture play at her own risk, and in case of accident or loss of life she or relations have no claim for damages against the party of the first part," etc., etc. I was all for leaving this offer stand and getting back to New York as fast as the street car would take me. "What do you expect me to do, lose my life?" I asked. "Accidents do sometimes happen," he volunteered. "Here, read a couple of manuscripts and judge for yourself." Then he handed me some manuscripts and walked out of the office. I read the first 3 episodes of this hairbreadth escape serial, and that was about enough for me. I shouted for help, and Mr. Gasnier entered from the next room. "Well, how do you like it?" he asked.
"Like it," I answered. "Here, take a look for yourself," and I began turning over the pages. "You can see for yourself I'm not the person for the part. In the first place, I'm too clumsy, and in the second place, I have too much respect for my life." In these first 3 episodes I had to play tennis, which I could not. I had to take a flight in an aeroplane, which I didn't like much because it was supposed to crash to the ground in a wreck. Then I had to drive a motor car through water, fire, and sand. This also didn't sound reasonable. Then I had to go out to sea in a yacht, which was all right, only that I was to jump overboard just as the boat was blown up by the villain, and I couldn't swim. Then I was to be in a captive balloon, but the villain was to cut the rope and I was to go sailing about for a while, then drop an anchor, which was to catch in a tree, and I was to descend some 250 feet on this, reaching a cliff on the side of a mountain. Then I was to be showered with rocks, but I didn't get any farther than the balloon. I lost my desire for that sport years before. "Well, you see," said I to Mr. Gasnier, "these things are not my line. Besides, you want an acrobat for this part. You don't want an actress." "I didn't say I wanted an actress," he very sweetly answered. "Then why did you send for—" My sense of humor began to gain consciousness, and I began to see light. "All right, you win," I had to laugh as I continued. "Give me the papers." And I signed what I thought was probably my death warrant. Now I had never had time in the days gone by to learn to swim, play golf, tennis, etc., etc. So, as an all-around athlete, I wasn't so good. However, as all sports depend more or less on the schooling of one's muscles, and in the old trapeze days I had developed and trained mine until I could control my entire body fairly easy, therefore it has not been difficult for me to learn to do a lot of different stunts. I started to work in the Perils of Pauline, the first serial of thrills that had ever been produced, and have continued in those kind of pictures, such as The Exploits of Elaine, The Iron Claw, Pearl of the Army, The Fatal Ring, The House of Hate, The Lightning Raider, and now In Secret, which have all been more or less the always in danger type of pictures. I would, of course, like to do big dramatic plays and act and all that sort of thing. However, I have been very successful in serials, so I shall just thank my lucky star and continue on until the public tires of me. Then I want to take some promising young girl and try to teach her to be what I would like to have been. But I do want to take one more try on the speaking stage before that time comes. I have worked on these last 3½ years following more or less the same routine. Up early in the morning, work all day long under the strong lights in the studio or in the hot sun or cold winds out of doors. I have remained in New York all the while, wearing furs in the summer and the thinnest kind of clothes in the winter a goodly bit of the time. For it seems that the minds of scenario writers turn toward summer scenes in the winter and toward winter scenes in the summertime. Therefore, we poor actors are about half of the time roasting or freezing while we work. The picture business is certainly not one of ease and comfort, and I think I can modestly say that my lot is just a little bit harder than most of the others in the profession, because I'm always doing some new stunt and nursing a lot of cuts, bruises, or sprains in consequence. Besides, although Pathé Frères have often advertised me as their peerless, fearless Pearl, we can put a very soft pedal on that, because I have been petrified with fear more than once during the filming of pictures. I have actually gotten to like fear, and like the sensation of taking some very dangerous chances that frighten me. My old heart beats a ragtime, and I face the music feeling more thrilled than I would be doing something in which I knew there was no risk. End of Part 11. Part 12 of Just Me by Pearl White. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. When I started to work in The Perils of Pauline, I took unto myself quite a task,
I spent a week before I started learning to play a fairly decent game of tennis. There is no danger attached to this sport, but you can certainly get a big collection of sore muscles when you start learning. I have also learned to drive a motor car and stand a smash up. During the filming of the first episode, I had to spend 3 or 4 hours each night in a swimming pool, learning to swim and dive. And so it has been ever since, even up to the present time. I'm always learning to do something new for each picture. I've even learned to fly an airplane, a feat that took me many months. If I have to jump off a moving train, automobile, etc., I always take myself out and try it several times until I get to be pretty sure of myself before they take the picture. If I have to do a big struggle or a fight the next day, I very often go into a gymnasium the night before and do a lot of work. Therefore, if I keep doing stunt pictures, by the time I reach 60, I ought to be quite an accomplished young lady. However, there are some things that can't be learned and you just have to take a chance. Ballooning is one of them. This merry old sport nearly cheated me out of fame and fortune. As I mentioned before, there was a balloon trip in the early chapters of Pauline's Perils, and somehow I wasn't so keen about ascending to the clouds as I would have been in my childhood days. Anyway, I started out to be a daredevil, and dare I must. Besides, I had gone through the experience of jumping off a yacht just before it exploded 2 miles off the coast of Florida a week before, and I had successfully swum to a waiting boat some distance away, dodging a couple of unfriendly sharks en route. So I couldn't allow myself to get too excited about this. The balloon was taken over to Palisade Park in Jersey, one nice windy day in March. The flight was to take place at 10 o'clock, but they didn't get it filled with gas until about 1:30, so I had a lot of time to stand around and get cold and nervous. I remember I borrowed a pencil from the cameraman and wrote out my will. I also gave my jewelry to different members of the company, telling them that it was to be theirs in case I didn't return. I did this to be funny, but it wasn't long until I felt pretty certain the joke was on me, and that my chances of reclaiming it were very remote. The plot was thus. The balloon was to be attached to a rope which was to be held by a lot of men. A man all done up in tights was preparing to make a flight before a cheering throng. Then I was to happen along with the hero and villain, who, by the way, was to have designs upon my young life. Said villain, in a frivolous moment, was to suggest that I, Pauline, would climb into the basket of the balloon and let him snap my picture with a camera that he had conveniently slung across his shoulders. Then the dirty work was to commence. I was to get into the basket and pose smiling. Then a henchman of the villain's was to ride a supposedly runaway horse into the crowd of men that were holding down the balloon. They were to let go in the panic and confusion, and the balloon was to sail into the air with me frantically screaming to the hero for help. Then, so the story ran, I was to drift about for many feet of film. Then get a bright idea and throw over the side of the basket a long rope with an anchor on the end of it. This anchor was to trail along and finally catch in a tree, and I was to climb down the rope to the tree. From there into the waiting arms of the hero, and remain safe in his protecting embrace until the next episode, when the villain would again pursue me. On this day we were to take only the first part where I left the ground, then take the balance of the scenes on Monday. This was Saturday. I had been carefully instructed just what to do when I got up in the air. I was to wait until I got out of range of the cameras, then pull the ripping cord that would allow the gas to escape from the balloon, and it would descend to the ground. The wind was blowing westward, and they figured that I could easily land about a half-mile away in some open country. Well, eventually they got everything set, and the cameramen started to grind their cameras. There were about 8 of them set up on different buildings in order to get different shots of the flight. I tripped into the scene arm in arm with my 2 companions, and we started the parade. I was awful cold and hungry, as I hadn't as yet had my lunch, and I didn't feel much like a heroine. Still, into the basket I climbed, and the excitement began. The horse dashed in, knocking down a couple of unsuspecting supers, and the men all let go of the balloon. That is, all except one, who in the confusion had neglected to loosen his grip. As I started upward, I heard about 50 voices shout, "Let go! Let go, you fool!" I couldn't see the man clinging to the rope beneath me, and I thought they were shouting at me, but what they wanted me to let go of I knew not. I had a large leather vanity case in my hand, so I tried that, and it struck a man square in the mouth, knocking out 2 of his perfectly good front teeth. But they still hollered, "Let go!" Now, the fellow on the rope must have come out of his trance and let go when he was about 15 feet up in the air. But of course I didn't see all of this, so I was pretty much worried about the "let go" order. Well, I didn't seem to be going up, but the earth seemed to be slipping away from me, and the people began to grow smaller. Then I looked down just ahead of me and saw nothing but water. Ye gods! The wind must have changed and I was sailing over the Hudson River due east and headed for New York City. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't have any desire to pull the cord and take a chance on landing in the water. It then struck me that I could employ the trusty old anchor rope of the story and maybe catch a stray tree on the banks of the river, but I remembered that that was lying back in Palisade Park, as we were not to use it in the scenes this day. I was getting rather panicky when I heard a deep voice coming from I know not where saying, "Can I come out now?" A terrible chill passed through my body and I looked around expecting to find ghosts or whatnot walking on thin air. I had just decided that maybe it was all right, and the high altitude must have been up about 1,000 feet by this time was playing strange tricks on my ears. Then the same voice repeated, "Can I come out now?" Only this time it was more urgent. The people on Earth had made a request to let go. Now there was a strange voice asking to come out. Well, I just about made up my mind to climb over the side and try walking down to Earth when I looked at the bottom of the basket and a pile of canvas began to move. Then out shot a face that I recognized as belonging to the owner of the balloon. I was surprised and speechless. He rose up and looked over the edge of the basket down below and said, "Oh, darn it, the wind's shifting. That's rotten luck." "Where did you come from?" I gasped. "Why," he replied, "I hid in the basket before the scene started so that I could bring the old gas bag down for you." The director hadn't told me this, thinking he would spring a surprise on me, and he did. But believe me, I was mighty glad to have a companion in my plight. "Where do we go from here?" I asked. "I don't know," he answered. "It depends upon which way the wind blows. Have a stick of gum?" And he slipped a package into my hand. "What for? So that I can stick to the ship?" I was making an attempt at comedy. "No, chew it to keep your ears and nose from bleeding, because sometimes they do up here." I thought he was joking, and I felt my nose to see if it was bleeding, but it wasn't, and he wasn't joking either. It seems that when you are up at a great height, and we were going up, he knew, chewing keeps the altitude from affecting your eardrums. "How far up are we now?" I asked. "Oh, about 3,000 feet," he answered. "Let's go down," I suggested. "Can't," he said, "because we're now over New York City and have no good place to land. We might get in a corner there and get bounced against a tall building." "Well, how long do we stay here?" I questioned. "Don't know that either. Anyway, make yourself comfortable and we'll have some lunch," he said, producing a couple of bottles of beer and some sandwiches. I took one, although I must admit my appetite wasn't with me so very strong. Anyway, I started to eat, and it sort of quieted my nerves for the moment. I looked down below and saw that we were over the lower end of Central Park, which for the moment seemed safe in case we were to go downward. But scarcely had I taken my last bite when I saw bad news in the distance. We were traveling southward at a goodly speed, and Columbus Circle loomed up, with its nice spiral statue standing in the middle, and it struck me that it would be very comic to descend right into the arms of old Columbus, who stands on the top of this tall building watching the crowds go by.
We shifted eastward over the Plaza, Netherlands, and Savoy hotels. The streets looked about 2 feet wide, and the buildings seemed about 5 feet high. However, I had seen them many times from below and knew their true height. Then we started westward, and things began to look worse. There was a terrible rumbling and conglomeration of noise, so I thought my ears must be playing me false, until my companion told me it was only the noise from the city below, which becomes louder as it travels upward. We were up then about 3,500 feet. The balloon took a plunge downward, and the shining steeple of St. Patrick's Cathedral and other churches began to show upon the horizon. Now, landing on a church steeple was a stunt to be feared, however religious one might be. And allow me to say that while New York may be a wicked city, still religion must flourish, according to the amount of churches I saw that day. Every place I looked I saw steeples that seemed as pointed as needles pointing up to the sky. End of Part 12. Part 13 of Just Me by Pearl White. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. We were slowly but surely going downward to perhaps drape our canvas on one of these. "Well, well," my companion ejaculated, "I've had my lunch and have no business downtown, so I guess we'd better be getting up." So saying, he opened up some sandbags that he had put in the balloon for ballast, and began throwing the sand overboard in handfuls. For each pound of weight you take from a balloon, it rises higher, and for each pound of gas that escapes from the bag, the balloon falls lower. The balloon was falling, so overboard started our ballast. About the third handful had been discharged when there was a terrific crash and a huge flash of light. "What's the matter?" I screamed with such a start that I almost went overboard myself. I thought surely we had dropped a bomb to the earth below. My companion was still cool and collected. I was cold, nearly freezing in fact, but collected I certainly was not. "We're running into a storm," he said. "Keep your head on your shoulders, and in a few minutes I'll show you a wonderful sight." Now I had seen just about enough for one excursion, but what could I do? He put me to work dishing out gobs of sand as fast as I could. We couldn't dump it all over at once, for fear of hitting some unsuspecting citizen's head. The people and the vehicles down on the street looked like flies. The sun was shining down there, but I could see these little specks starting to hurry along. Evidently they could see our storm descending upon them, and they were seeking shelter. We were starting upward at a pretty good gait. It was getting terribly dark, and during the flashes of lightning that were coming thick and furious, I got a peek of my companion's face. Disgusting! He was calmly chewing his gum and whistling odd snatches from "My Old Kentucky Home." Home! That word nearly made me burst into tears. I knew that we were almost directly over my own hotel room home, but I wasn't even fussy. Anybody's home would have done if I could have but reached one. Then came a terrible crash. I shut my eyes, fearing the worst. Then began a terrible bombardment. Something was hitting me from all directions. I opened my eyes and saw it was huge drops of water. Evidently the cloud we were in had burst. I didn't ask questions now, but just kept on throwing the old sand overboard, which by the same token had nearly been exhausted. I could see but little. I felt the rain battering against us, and between peals of thunder heard my companion shout, "Look up!" which I promptly did. The darkness began to fade, and I saw we were climbing up into a very bright spot. I wouldn't have been surprised to find that we were going to land on the sun or moon. In fact, nothing could surprise me after this. So I thought, "We're up about 4,500 feet now." The other one shouted, "If the ballast holds out, we can clear this mess." Things were brightening up every moment, and after we had thrown over the last of our sand, we were sailing along in a clear bright sky with the terrible hot sun shining upon us. We were going through all the stages of a Turkish bath. The instruments told us we were up 5,000 feet.
The rain, lightning, and thunder were still raging beneath us. "Well, we might as well take it easy," my companion said, "until the storm breaks beneath us. Then I will begin to figure how we can get down." Well, it was such a wonderful sight watching the old storm carry on between us and the earth, that I got all over being afraid for the moment and began to think more or less normally. I had a big roll of advertising proof sheets in my overcoat pocket that had been handed to me that morning, so I took them in hand and began to look them over. They were different sketches of newspaper publicity which I was going to receive. Some covered an entire newspaper sheet with a life-size face photograph of myself, with huge headlines proclaiming my talents and daring to the unsuspecting public. Now, up until that time, no one in the picture business had received such expensive advertisements. Of course, the Hearst newspapers were interested in The Perils of Pauline, and they gave me newspaper space that couldn't be bought for any amount of money. I remember one ad read, "Watch this rising young star," meaning me, "and see how quickly she ascends to the very top." What a bromide that line was to me at the moment. I was ascending like a skyrocket, but to what? I thought of all the publicity they were going to give me, and I felt sure that after all my years of struggling, fame was awaiting me back on earth. Here I was up in the air for nearly 2 hours, and maybe when I did come down I would be a corpse, and only a short item in the birth and death column would tell of my heroic end. Gosh! These thoughts certainly messed up my peace and quiet. Then all of a sudden I began to feel like I was a merry-go-round, and I began to get awfully dizzy. I looked at my aero partner, and his face was growing whiter by the second. "Oh my God, I'm getting sick," he gasped. "The storm has lifted, and I want to get back to earth before I lose my lunch and my sweet disposition." He was looking pretty rocky, but he was certainly gaining my respect through showing the signs of ordinary human weakness. I was getting awfully sick, too, but I felt that at least I was finding a friendly soul in my suffering. It seems that the balloon had gotten into a pocket of wind which made it keep spinning around in circles. This, by the way, has cured me of ever wanting to ride on a merry-go-round again. I thought of the city down below that only a few years ago I had come to conquer. I leaned far over the edge of the basket to give one farewell look at old Broadway, but I could see nothing but blue space. I turned back to my newfound friend and announced the fact that we must be nowhere because I couldn't see nothing. The balloon was steadying itself up again, so he summoned up enough strength and courage to take up his glasses and take a chance looking downward. "Oh, good news!" he exclaimed. "We are going out to sea. I can just catch the outline of the Statue of Liberty, which, by the way, we are leaving behind us, so," he continued, "we had better land right now." "In the water?" says I. "Certainly," says he. "Now when we start down we might go pretty fast, but stick to the ship and don't jump until I do." "Yes, and when we do land in the water, what becomes of us from there on?" I questioned. "Oh, the only thing to do is to stay clear of the gas bag until she empties, and we'll only have to swim about for a little while until there'll be a dozen boats to our rescue." That swimming around didn't sound so good. Anyway, he gave me a big roll of tissue paper, of which he instructed me to tear off strips and throw them overboard. We would watch these strips of tissue as they drifted down through the air and see which way the wind was blowing, due south, north, east, or west. While only a few feet below, the wind might be coming from another direction. I tore off yards of paper, and my friend let a little gas out of the balloon at a time. We were sinking quite rapidly toward our watery landing. "Say," says I in a moment of thought, "I'm to jump into the water when you do. That's fair enough, but do you realize how cold that water is going to be? It's still the month of March, you know." I saw him shiver, and again he arose in my esteem. I was getting to like this fellow. "Gosh, I wish I had a drink," he tearfully sighed. We were down to about 2,500 feet now, so I took off my coat and shoes to get ready for the plunge. Then fate stepped in and threw us into a strong, freezing north wind
that carried us up over Battery Place. That was awful, and the downtown buildings started to loom up again. We didn't dare take a chance of dropping any lower, and from now on we could only hope to wait until we were carried somewhere into open country. We crossed over the downtown district and then swung up the North River, then across Blackwell's Island, then back again south over toward Brooklyn for a while. More gas escaping from the balloon all the time. We had been up now over 3 hours, and by this time we were flying only about 1,800 feet up. Then we took another turn north, and we saw a large open space before us. "Ah, this is our chance," said my companion. "Take the glasses and see what it is." I took a peek and saw that the ground was dotted with little blocks of marble. Oh, gentle Kaiser, it was a cemetery. "Well," I said, "I guess it's the graveyard for us, and anyway it may be better so, 'cause most likely that's going to be our home from now on." But that was not to be. We only passed over one corner of the cemetery, so landing there was out. We drifted on for about half an hour and were getting a little lower down all the time. Then a little open country was sighted in the distance with the Long Island Sound behind it. If we could only make that, and it seemed that we could. I could distinguish men, women, cars, wagons, dogs, and children following us on a run below. Evidently they could see our balloon hovering above them and wanted to be on the spot when we landed. Good luck was with us for sure. We reached an open space, and my friend pulled the ripping cord. There was a terrible smell of gas, and it seemed that the ground was coming up to meet us. I could see thousands of people waiting below, with upstretched arms, and it seemed as though they must be welcoming me back to the earth and fame. Be that as it may. Note: if in this story I have offended anyone whose name I have used, I am sincerely sorry, because I have not meant to do so. It may seem that I have dealt not too kindly with my parents during the early period of my life. I can but say I have written of things just as they have impressed me. The treatment they gave to me was stern indeed, but I now realize that I was a headstrong, stubborn child, and evidently the methods they employed must have been the right ones, for I have turned out a financial success at least. Everybody who knows my father and stepmother likes them, so at heart they must be good, and I'm glad that when the Almighty dealt out parents that I drew the ones I did. To you, kind readers, I ask only that you will please look upon me as just a regular human being, and we who have made our money here in America, whoever we may be, let us stick up for her, fight for her, and respect and honor every being who has given his life to make us the independent people that we are. Pearl White. End of Part 13. End of Just Me by Pearl White. Recording by Pamela Krantz. June 2012.